the black vault intake. I measure my memory and interruptions. The record on the table is a thin cylinder of plastic and metal, its mouth a simple wire that holds a thin magnet and a promiser someone will listen. If anyone asks later whether what follows is a confession, a truth, or a failure of a mind broken into story, the answer will be crooked. These pages this voice print the recorder will store are an attempt to scrape clean one small window of what was taken in the black vault. The room is a wound in the building. Damp stone, sealed seams, and the breath of men who come and go, leaving only a faint chemical tang that never leaves. The light is candle and bulb, the two modes of the vault, honest flame and clinical white.
I remember a time when
they prefer the gray that sits between. I prefer the memory that sits between certainty and suggestion. Both are propped on the same bench. They made a theatre of the archive, a long oak table, a chair bolted to the floor for me, another chair for the person who sits and smiles and writes. They called him Colonel. He wore a lapel pin the color of tarnish and moved like someone who believed his hands could sew fact to file. He brought records into the room like offerings. He lifted them off shelves and set them down as if arranging corpses in rows. My role, as I came to understand it, was simple and complicated to become legible, to be translated from the clumsy human grit of memory into a neat, serviceable script. Confession is a transcription process. The instruments vary. Sometimes it is a thin boot heel against a shin, an old habit of pressure. Sometimes it is a promise, a lullaby dressed as a threat. Sometimes it is a ledger, and the ledger is more cruel than any instrument, for ledgers do not pause to listen, they only receive. The ledger wanted names. I had a name once that fit in my mouth like a stone. They wrapped that stone in other stones until it was indistinguishable from the floor. They pressed until the shape of what I knew could be read in the grooves the pressure left. The thing that came free was not always mine. I learned to speak around the holes that interrogation made. I learned to keep a small spine of truth. A kernel, a folded index card, a scarf not tucked inside a collar. I made notes into the seams of my clothing. I kept a paper fragment behind my ear and learned the measures of breathing that let me feel like myself for short intervals. It is surprising what a person will notice when everything else is taken, the rhythm of a ceiling drip, how the flame of a candle leaps when a door opens, the exact pitch of Colonel Myrov's whisper of a cough when he reads a name and watches my face. Names are architecture in the vault. A name opens a drawer reveals a photograph, the photograph insists on a memory. Some names belong to people I had touched, people who had lives and trays of soft bread and mornings. And I gave up those names with a kind of grief that looked like compliance. Some names belonged to people whose faces I did not know, and those names fit into the ledger like borrowed clothes. They hung there, waiting to be worn. The ledger is an enterprise of fiction, making that required only a narrator. They taught me to be that narrator. They placed old files in front of me and asked the same prompt: who, what, when, why. The prompts are neutral, the answers are metal. When I could not supply a detail, they supplied one for me. A photograph with an unfamiliar profile was turned toward me until my eyes made it a person I had known. I was told where to remember a meeting. I was told which room I had been in and with whom. Given enough coaxing, given enough pressure and lullaby and ledger, the human throat rearranges itself to answer. It is not that they changed method, they encouraged me to become the instrument of their own history. Archivist Lena Orlova was the only person in the room who hesitated. She did not wear interrogator's iron. She wore the quiet of someone whose whole life bent toward keeping records intact. She handled files the way a priest handles relics, with gloves, with distance, with the sense that the object might bite. She would slide a photograph toward the colonel, keep her head down, and whisper the date of a birth or death like stepping over a grave. Her ledger was thinner than the official one is. It contained marginalia anomalies, notations of names that did not belong, dates that contradicted other dates, things that should not fit but did. She watched me with a grief that sometimes cracked into a small, private sympathy. Once, without meaning to, she left a small folded note on the shelf where she believed no one would see. It read, "Remember which parts are yours." I held that note like a foreign object for a week, turning it in my palm in the dark, tasting the paper as if it could smooth the edges of what I was allowed to keep. The confessions in the vault were not always confessions, they were performances given structure by the people who needed them. I learned the grammar, keep to certain verbs, avoid any adverbs that might suggest nuance. Nuance was the one luxury they would not allow. The colonel preferred clean verbs: arrange, attend, deliver, destroy. He liked to watch my face as I pronounced them. He counted aloud sometimes, softly, the way a predator counts out the distance of a leap. There were hours when I was asked to describe events I was certain had never happened. In those hours the mind becomes a place of mirrors, each reflecting a version of the same room back onto itself until you cannot tell which image is the original. When someone insists on a detail enough times, when they pretend it has occurred with absolute tenderness and patience, the mind will unspool a cloth of memory to match. That is how invented ghosts are born. They are not necessarily lies. They are artifacts of coercion. What grows when the pressure around an empty place is steady and measured? I kept a record in my own way. I spoke sequences and mumbled them into the recorder when the lights were low and the colonel had left the room. The recorder laughed faintly when I pressed play and found that the voice that came back was thinner, as if worn by the machine's need to conserve. I spoke the names that felt like my own and left the others to the ledger. I attempted to map which confessions had been imposed and which had been excavated from the slow decay of memory. Sometimes the tapes in the vault told of monster state men who made lists and enforced them, men who believed in the geometry of control. But the more disturbing recordings were the ones where the prisoner confessed to crimes that made no sense in the life he had been shown. A man who had never left his village would confess to meetings in ports he had never seen. A woman would describe a child that did not exist. The ledger allowed these false designations to matriculate into official memory. The state, through the vault, learned to gender the impossible as true. There is a moment in each session that I have come to call the ungluing. It is a small fracture, a sound like a tiny door unseating from its hinge. It happens the moment a name is offered to you, and it settles into the rack of your mind that has always carried your private truths. The ungluing is painless at first. It feels like being told the wrong time and believing it. Later it becomes a pain that runs through the bones, an ache that makes sleep impossible. Colonel Marov liked to use silence as a tool. He applied it like ointment, letting it cool and congeal around the edges of a question. The silence made me fill the space with sound. My own voice is the easiest thing to harvest. Once a sound is produced, it can be pried and catalogued. He would tilt his head, watch the recorder, and then slide a file closer with a slow, deliberate hand. The file smelled of old glue and cigarettes. He would open it and point at a name with a gloved finger. The name alone could become an instruction. I will not pretend there were not moments when I believed the things I said. That is another cruelty of the vault, to have something you invent accepted as evidence, and then to begin to inhabit that fiction until it feels as sturdy and warm as a sweater. In those moments I would think I had committed the thing in question. I would feel guilt, as if it were an old garment put back on. Later, in the wash of solitude and lower lights, I would peel that garment off and examine the seams. Sometimes a seam contained writing I had never put there. There was an occasion when the ledger held a sequence of confessions that all fit together like a map of a nebulous crime. Several prisoners, isolated, produced overlapping fragments, a meeting in a cellar on a certain night, a man with a scar on his cheek, a box that was moved from a house to a riverside. Each fragment matched a file in the colonel's hand, and though none of the prisoners had met one another, the ledger assembled them into a network. The archivists marginalia protested dates that could not align, names recycled, handwriting that did not match the records. The colonel smiled when he read those protests. It was the smile of a man who knows the ledger can become what he asks. I began to think of the vault as a loom. Threads of memory were passed over and under by people who desired a picture scandal, subterfuge, enemy. The loom did not care whether the threads were true. It cared only for the pattern. I was a thread, so were others. We were woven into a tapestry that would hang in an office long after the smell of candle and cigarette was gone. On nights when the guards were fewer and the candle light was a single guttering thing, I would watch the reflection in the puddle beneath the table. Faces came to me in that reflection like things that had been washed ashore. Once in the sheen of a puddle, I saw another face that was not mine, the face of a man whose features matched a photograph the colonel had placed on the table 3 days earlier. I had never seen him outside paper. In the puddle the face may have been looking back, may have been looking through me. The record will say whether that was madness. I will say only that memory sometimes borrows the faces it needs. There is a small key in the colonel's hand that he keeps in the palm in a way that is intimate and casual. He does not use it for doors. He uses it as a counting tool, as a talisman. He has one key for the vault and several others that are only for show. Once he dropped it, and it fell in a slow metallic sound against the stone. Lena picked it up almost without asking and told him the wrong number from her ledger. He laughed then, a short sound. I catalogued that laugh as if it were a new kind of instrument. I have had the experience of being asked to remember a face and being given a photograph of a man who did not exist. The ledger wanted something to hold on to, and the mind, obedient and hungry, created. That is the true cost. Not merely the bruises or the hunger or the broken nights, those are the visible debts. The true debt is to have one's memory become negotiation, to see a photograph deliberately set before you and to fashion yourself into it until you cannot tell which self is residue and which is truth. When I left the vault, not by choice but by a break in the ledger swill, I found that the outside world had its own unforgiving detail light. Light makes everything legible. In the open air, the petty lies of the vault fall apart like paper in rain. But the ledger's work does not unwind there. Files find their way back into cabinets. The state keeps what it needs and discards what it does not. I was discarded the way one discards used paper, folded, perfunctory, and left on a shelf where no one would find me if they were not willing to look for what was missing. I do not know how many of the confessions I gave in the black vault matched a world outside that room. I do not even know whether the world outside is the map everyone else is using. I have learned the grammar of doubt. I have learned what can be kept and what cannot. I keep the small things, the knot of a scarf, the rhythm of my fingers on my wrist, the sound a key makes when it is not allowed to turn. These are my records. At the end of one sequence, I was asked to sign a transcript. They offered me a pen whose cap was sticky with nicotine. I held it like an accusation and refused on principle to mark what might become a document they could file without the mess and malleability of human voice. They told me that signatures were ceremonial, that the ledger did not need it, that it would be for the sake of order. I watched the colonel watch me and felt something like compassion for him because he believed in his documents with a ferocity that made him kind in his own mind. Archivist Lena kept a small ledger of her own. When she left a note, it was never about instruction. It was always a fragment of an index card, a name, an inventory number, a date that did not belong. She would slide it along the shelf toward me like a secret. Once the fragment contained a single liner, some things cannot be filed. I clutched that line as if it were a charm. People ask later whether the vault made monsters. I would answer that the vault made machinery. Machines have no conscience. People operating the machines sometimes do not. The colonel had a conscience calibrated to efficiency. Lena had a conscience that crept like moss in damp places. I had a conscience that was a ledger in my head and a piece of paper in my shoe. The machine produces artifacts, confessions that look official, names that are sharp and intractable on paper. Those artifacts are used to explain events, to justify actions, to close the book. This record is not meant to exonerate or to condemn in simple forms. It is meant to be a map of the way memory becomes commodity when placed in the hands of men who write history with a scalpel instead of a pen. The Black Vault kept its own weather cycles of bright, aggressive daylight in which the ledger was fed, and cold, early nights where the prisoners sat with the flame and tried to remember whose voice they had once had. If this account survives, it will do so as another fragment in someone else's ledger. Perhaps it will be used to stitch a corrected picture. Perhaps it will be shelved and annotated and then refiled under a different name. That possibility no longer gives me hope. I have learned to hold hope the way a man holds a single coin, close to his chest and out of sight. I end this record with a small instruction to anyone who will one day read these lines, attend to marginalia. The truth of the vault hides in the little protests, the tiny numbers written in the margins, the notes that refuse the tidy story. The ledger is loud and confident. The margins whisper. The margins remember which parts were never given and which parts were taken. There is no dramatic ending to this chapter. There is only the slow arithmetic of forgetting and the persistence of a few small things. A scarf knot, a folded index card, a note that reads, "Remember which parts are yours." I keep these like contraband. They are the only things the vault could not file. The Black Vault confession unraveling. I write this with hands that still remember straps and cold metal. The pen slides over a paper made thinner by too many readings, by the oil of other palms, and the damp breath of cellars. I do not pretend to remember everything in order. That is the very thing they broke me for, the steady architecture of memory, and the effort to rebuild it is the portion of my punishment that remains. This is an account of the second night in the Black Vault, the middle hours, when questions obscure into shapes and names become levers. The vault is a throat carved beneath the city. You go down and down until the clink of footsteps above becomes an accusation, until the air tastes like a locked jaw. They painted the walls with faint attempts at antiseptic, but the paint flaked into the same grays as the stone. There are no windows. There are only candles with their faces turned cruelly away from the prisoner, their flames pretending to be mercy. The light is oil, painting thin rim, lit collars, polished cheekbones, the kind of chiaroscuro that records every hollow and scar. That light is a part of the work. It keeps the edges sharp so they may cut. I was brought to the chair that night with a recorder in front of me and a file beside the table. The recorder was not the kind with a microphone and a forgiving spool. It was a slim metal thing with a cold mouth and a small red light that blinked like a heart. The file had a name already written on its first page, as though my confession was merely a stamp to be pressed into paper. I do not know whether I first read their accusation or whether my bones felt it before my eyes did. Accusations are denser. They sit like metal coins until you force them to ring. Colonel Myrov sat across from me, a small brass key on a chain at his throat. He had the posture of someone who measures the world by what can be bent. His hands were patient. His voice, when I first registered it, was the sort that could tauten air silk. It folded questions into silences and handed them to me with the sweetness of a bribe. There was a smile always waiting in the creases around his mouth, a smile that had been practiced into cruelty. Lena stood in the corner, catalogue, as if grief could be filed and indexed. Her fingers smelled of old paper and chamomile. She handled the files like a widow handling an heirloom she did not love. The method of coercion in the vault is less theatrical than the stories suggest. There is no single instrument of terror that makes you confess. There is rhythm. There is hunger timed with the extinguishing of a candle. There is the slow removal of light from your periphery until the room condenses into the shape of a single idea. There is the arrangement of names on paper in a way that will lead your mind to bracket falsehood into truth. You begin to see what they expect, and in that seeing, you begin to imitate it. Impossibility bows to repetition. You find yourself creating an architecture to support their questions, and then living inside that architecture until it is indistinguishable from memory. I had been held before. I had known surfaces of humiliation and the blunt science of sleep deprivation. But the vault teaches a different lesson. It teaches you that the self has seams, and that these seams can be pried apart and grafted. They asked me to name people I had never seen. They asked me to describe networks that never existed. They put photographs in front of me and asked whether the faces were familiar. My answer was a rib of gas airless enough to hold under a bell jar. Sometimes the correct answer was the one that made the file close neatly. Sometimes confessing a fabrication granted a small reprieve, a bowl of broth that tasted like the idea of mercy. The second night was the night I began to believe the invented things. It is a strange thing to record believing on command. When you are told, in the softness of a practiced voice, that a man you never met is your handler, and that you betrayed unnamed comrades. The mind searches for matching photographs in its attic. A photograph is found, or a feature is misremembered to match the suggestion, and once matched, it becomes proof of a life you did not live. The technique is not force so much as choreography. They lead you in a slow dance, and then assert that the steps you just performed are your own. I scribble now the names I said that night, because the ledger will not accept erasures. Some names are ordinary, and will mean little to anyone who opens this paper after me. Other names are like keys that slide into a lock, and make the whole thing click. I said names under pressure that later returned to me like seeds a dog carries and cannot bury. I remember the feeling of names as objects. I remember a name feeling like a cold copper coin, another like a scrap of thread pulled through a hardened seam. The act of pronouncing a name in that room was the act of building testimony to a thing that might not exist. When you pronounce it often enough, the mouth believes. There was a moment when the record made a sound that sat in my bones. The recorder had a metallic breath, and it caught a cough from my chest, and the sound was held like a bell. The bell made a memory. The room afterwards rearranged itself around that sound. I found myself tying events to the bell as anchors, the hour of the bell, the cadence of Myrov's pen, the way Lena's shoulders would tighten when a page had a name she did not expect to see. The vault organizes time into beats, and each beat is an instrument. I did not see my neighbors. The cells are separated by stone, and the vault is a geometry of privacy for public shame. Yet confession is communal in other ways. Your voice travels in ways you cannot imagine. Sometimes on the stairwell a hand would be waiting with an index card. Sometimes a scrap would be slid beneath the door with a short sentence, a name, a date, a small correction. Once someone left a palm print in charcoal and a single number. We learned to read the minor outcasts left between interrogations. These messages became less about truth and more about tenderness, advice on how to hold breath during a particular light test, the location of a hidden knot in a tunic, the one phrase that would loosen the collar of a steel, braced question. The strangest confessions were those that spoke of people who had never been. A prisoner would describe meetings, instructions, cellars within cellars, faces that existed only as descriptions. The archivist would catalogue these confessions in a ledger that had an epidermis of its ogre ink, smudged, edges dog-eared, corners softened by many hands. Lena kept a record of anomalies. She would circle a line and mark it with a faint, sorrowful asterisk. I watched her once watching me, and I thought I saw in her face the rumor of rebellion, not the loud kind, but the practical kind. The kind that saves a piece of ledgers from being burned. They asked me to narrate crimes that my mouth had not committed. In trying to comply, my memory became a workshop. I would take scraps and stitch them into plausible things. The vault rewards invention. It rewards detail. If you can name the color of a coat you never saw, they will trust that you were there. If you recall a throwaway remark and the time of day it was made, then the file grows weight and you become convenient. Convenience is the mechanism of safety inside the vault. It is a currency that can buy a night of sleep or a small bowl. But safety purchased this way is false. It blunts the soul into a merchant who assesses how much of truth to sell at a given moment. There was a file that those in power adored, a file that had been built as an edifice of witness statements, printed telegrams, grainy photographs. They lowered that file like a reliquary before me and instructed me to confess in a way that would make the file tidy. I thought of windows and edges, and of what a tidy life might look like if I had not been bent. I tried to place my footsteps where the file asked in the warehouse near the third beam at the hour when a train passed and a lantern faltered. The image was precise and therefore contagious. Once I drew it, I believed it. There are confessions that do something else as they open doors. Some admissions do not conclude, but lead. A name is given, and an entire hallway of memory slides like a bookcase and reveals a passage none of my feet had trod. I remember that phenomenon with a clarity like pain. I said a name and the door to a room I did not know I had entered collapsed inward. Inside were things that could not belong to me because they belonged to the organization that had been building a mythology of enemies. Those rooms had models and charts and a system of ghosts assigned to suit the needs of policy. You can confess to them. Once you do, they are real in the same way a map is real. They alter what future hands will expect to find in the landscape. You ask how one resists. The honest answer is that resistance is fray like old rope. There are tricks. One keeps the mind engaged in the mechanics of a memory rather than the memory itself. One counts the knots in the chair, notes the way the candle smoke curls, maps the grain of the table. In the vault, even resistance can be turned into confession. The act of meticulous observation becomes testimony. The interrogator will gently point this out, and you will see how your refusal has already been catalogued as another data point. The only true resistance is to refuse to give them a pattern they can feed. But patterns are smaller things than human hunger. The body wants water. The body wants warmth. The body tells you that survival is a negotiation. At a certain hour I do not have the number, because their clocks are cunningly unreliable, I said. Something that did not wholly belong to me. It was an admission of meetings in Minsk, of a courier who carried messages inside hollowed coins. The recording light held the confession like a jewel. Later the ledger called it a link. The archivists took that link and attached it to other links until a chain formed. And when chains form, they anchor policy. That is the arithmetic of the vault statements. Assembled become architecture, and architecture passes into law. There are evenings when I relive not the facts, but the sensations. The way Myrov would tilt his head and count under his breath before a question. The way Lena would fold a file and slide it into the dark edges of a shelf. There is a bruise on my left wrist that is a fossil of a particular knot. There is a scarf tucked in my collar with a knot shaped like a promise. I keep it folded there despite the cold. It is an amulet against inertia. The scars and tokens are the private grammar of survival. I am not telling you this to excuse what I said. There are consequences that ripple beyond any single ledger. A name is a weight that can crush other peoples. A false name can send another body into a vault and into a chair that remembers the shape of blame. I do not know what those names have done after I spoke them. Sometimes I catch at the idea as if it were a rope and I imagine it tying some other life to a fate I cannot reverse. That image keeps me awake when I would otherwise sleep. There were nights when Lena left me a margin note. At first not for me specifically, but for the record. She would circle lines and add a faint dash, perhaps a correction. Once she left a small slip of paper folded tight that contained a single line, "Remember the way the recorder breathes." That line felt like a hand on my shoulder. It was a small human act in a system designed to strip such things away. The vault teaches us that truth is instruments arranged with sufficient authority. I lived by that rule for a long time, and I am still living in the shadow of it. To confess in that place is to submit words to a machine that will assemble them into policy and punishment. To survive is to learn which words buy small mercies, and which will make an edifice out of your life. This second night ended as others do, with the light trimmed to a thin thread, and the recorder stopping its tiny red blink. My throat remembered the taste of a word. My mouth had memorized a geography. They left me to the dark and took the file away. Later I would discover what architecture they had built from my lies, and what doors those architectures opened. For now I record what I can: the sequence of lights, the manner of a name, the way the recorder kept the cough of a body like a bell. It is modest work to resist a machine by keeping an honest list of how it operates. The list is a pattern that may one day help undo the very rooms they built from our confessions. If you read this and think you understand why I said what I did, know that the vault does not make choices for you, it makes choices easy. It gives you bargains. It shows you convenient crimes and offers proof in the form of photographs, of printed notes that have been aged to match your skin. The most frightening fact is the ordinary genius of that method. It does not rely on torture as spectacle. It relies on construction. It constructs reality out of need, and then consigns you to the reality you helped to build. I leave this page with the knowledge that some confessions will be accepted into record, and that others will be dismissed as noise. I leave it with the names I could not keep, and with the small gestures of softness that persisted, a folded scrap tucked into a sleeve, a recorder that caught a cough and kept it like a fossil, an archivist who circled a line and looked away as if she had seen more than she should. They will call these things paranoia and therefore harmless. They will call some confessions useful and others expendable. Remember that usefulness is an instrument of power. I close by recording the smallest fact I can own without fear of it being turned into a hing, the shape of the scarf knot at my collar, and the way the candle's smoke always turns toward the corner at the precise moment someone speaks my name. That corner is a truth I think belongs only to me. I will keep it folded like the index card I have tucked into my shoe, until the day the ledger that catalogues me is torn apart and the truth can be allowed to breathe without being built into weaponry. If you find this ledger after me, hold it to the light and see whether the shadows inside it are theirs or yours. Remember that the vault made a tradie. It bought our certainty and paid us in small comforts. What it sold back to the world was architecture, a map of enemies constructed from our thin, broken testimony. Keep that in mind when you read the names that follow in other files. They might have been chosen, arranged, and polished to fit a story someone needed to tell about control. If you read and feel the old cold, know that there were hands that guided the confession before you even had the chance to speak. The black vault, the confessor's mirror. I write this by the thin light of a single candle. Its flame pools on the metal table like a small, impatient moon. The recorder sits between my palms, a cool, clinical thing whose seam presses through skin and seems to rest on bone. I have learned the recorder's weight and its way of organizing the room into minutes. Here they teach candor as a craft. Fold the truth into the contours they prefer, or they will make you honest by other means. My honesty arrives in fragments. This chamber swallows daylight and spits it somewhere else. The walls breathe cold. If you listen long enough, you think the noises are only the building pipes arguing. Stones settling in a slow gavotte, but I have learned that behind the plaster there is activity that reads like paper, files shifting, names sliding on ledgers. That sound has a rhythm intake, ledger, shutter. If the tapping of the recorder finds that rhythm, my memories clack into place and fracture. They call me subject. On paper I am codename 47, a neat entry in a column that closes an interrogation. Colonel Myrov approaches his questions with a courtesy honed on other people's failures. He brings with him an old brass key that gleams with the rightness of expected answers. He inhabits the shadow of the room like a statue and uses silence as a blady quiet is a tool to open mouths. Lena Orlova, the archivist, moves among files like a woman married to paper, fingers often ink stained. She keeps a ledger of anomalies folded under her cardigan, margins annotated with tiny rebellions she does not speak aloud. I arrived with a memory I trusted, a street in winter, peat and horseflesh, a face that might have been mine or one I had learned to wear. They worked that memory with both gentle instruments and blunt ones. Questions pressed until edges frayed, answers bled into each other and could be pried into confessions. The early days were a slow erosion, then the work quickened into fever, where even dreams earned catalog numbers. I discovered a practical arithmetic of forgetting, name a thing enough, and the ledger consumes it. Once ledgered, it becomes evidence. Proof is a weapon inside the vault. The tape records me, and I record myself to preserve the portions of me not yet legislated into their reports. Between the colonel's calibrated silences and Lena's clerical gestures, I learned to measure the intervals like a prisoner counts breaths. The ledger wants numbers. The vault wants tidy arcs. It wants to turn a messy, irregular human into a file with a margin noted broken, unreliable, corrected. Each time I describe an image, the ledger takes a slice and stamps it with legitimacy. There is a practice here, give them something they can fashion into meaning, and they will return a smaller, obedient version of you. I do not entirely resent this. To survive is to accrue small compliances. I learned to fold phrases the way Lena folds paper with exaggerated care so the edges would be neat. I learned to put my fingers in particular grooves of memory and lift out fragments that might be useful, or at least wearable. The colonel collects those fragments like spoons, uniform, unblemished. At first the fragments were plain names, places, dates. Then they grew darker, more ornate. They demanded networks where only a single person had stood. They wanted plots where only tired, private rebellions had happened. Sometimes a confession required a ghost, an accomplice, a disappeared contact. I learned to name people I had never met because the vault bestows substance to named things. The ledger gives existence to invention. This is how the state expands. A shadow gets a file, then the file is treated as law. Uncertainty is punished here in a special cruelty. If you are unsure of a night or a face, they mark the gap and fill it with a more convenient certainty. Silence is Colonel Myrov's loudest instrument. He will still the room until my imagination begins to hum, and then he asks for a small concession, a name, a date. The admission is specific enough to be useful and vague enough to be plausible. Once I commit to detail, they scratch it into the record as if ink could make it irrevocable. The more we approach truth, the more the vault fascinates me. I have seen confessions that refuse to behave, that spiral and collapse. Some honest accounts are deemed useless and excised with polite surgical hands. Others shine like polished inventions, models used later to reconstruct other people's guilt. The vault is not a temple of truth so much as an atelier where truth is shaped to fit power. Power smells of disinfectant and warmth. There are nights when the walls seem to answer. Once, in a long hour that tasted of damp paper, I heard a voice fold into my own. It wasn't human. It felt like the trace of a confession left on a ledger, an echo of a name scrubbed away. In that scraping hush I saw a face in a puddle of water on the floor. It was not mine. It was made of parts of faces I've seen on files and in memory's flashes. The face smiled with the courtesy of an invented witness and sank beneath the water like a coin. The vault's cruel talent is not only to rewrite you, but to fabricate the people who will confirm your existence. Lena keeps a ledger of exceptions. She will bring it to the table under the pretense of cross-referencing, and, with a move so slight I might have missed it, slide an entry toward me. The page holds dates that don't match official files, names with small question marks, margins penciled with doubts. Her hands tremble when she does this. It is the only time she looks like someone who still loves the idea of truth. I have tried to read her page by candlelight. Some lines are smudged as if someone attempted to scrub facts after writing them. I do not know if she keeps that ledger for me or for herself. Perhaps she is merely practicing her vocation, storing contradictions until some future accounting arrives. The colonel wears his key on a chain, old brass softened by touch. He dangles it like a compliment and lets it clatter against the table with the precision of a clock. When he wants a particular answer, he sets the key down and lets it roll a half. Turn, the whisper of metal becomes promise. The sound has become, perversely, an index of my honesty. The minute the metal murmurs, I feel myself aligned to the expected reply. Once I found a file with my name and a photograph I did not recognize. The picture had been pinned to a salt-streaked wall and torn out, and only margins remained. In the corner was a faint handprint that matched the scar on my cheek. The vault is patient, it binds disparate truths and waits. A handprint is a tender sort of evidence, intimate, hard to deny. Context remains pliable. A handprint can mean guilt or mere presence, and the vault picks whichever meaning suits that day's narrative. I keep a small ritual now. When Lena slides me an anomaly, I tuck it under the collar of my tunic like a moth's wing and press it into memory. I breathe with it. I press my fingers to the worn index card hidden in my shoe and fold memory around that tactile honesty. The card is a small act of possession. It is mine, and while it stays hidden, I can refuse some of the ledger's choices. They cannot reach what lives in the dark of a shoe. As interrogations deepen, the ledger grows, elaborate names, contacts in cities I've never visited, meetings mapped in impossible patterns. I protest. Protests here are soft paper tossed into wind. The colonel notes them with the neutrality he applies to weather updates, makes a mark, then asks a question that turns the protest into a new thread. That is their method. Acknowledge refusal, then braid it into the proof they wish to weave. Resistance becomes raw material. There is a daytime memory. I keep trying to rescue a child at a station platform with a knitted hat, a ticket held in small frozen hands. I can still see the cheap wool and the child's breath fogging the glass, but I cannot place the child in ledger-friendly context. When I offer the detail, the colonel tilts his head and silence works on me again. The detail is not useful, so it is not true enough. The vault will not accept what cannot be turned into leverage. Exhaustion produces confessions the ledger sometimes cannot swallow. I have offered them scenes that end with a door opening onto a corridor that loops back into itself. They frowned in the necessary way. Helena made a discreet notation about instability. This is another trick. Mistakes are medicalized and archived. Madness is a convenient jar for contradiction. They have techniques for making a person testify to things they never did. One is the replay. They place evidence close enough to truth to encourage embellishment. A photograph of a man on a bench, a torn letter. You hunger for coherence and fill the blanks with invented detail, because the mind prefers an ugly, coherent story to a pretty, scattered honesty. Another method is the echo. Repeat a phrase often enough about someone and memory adapts its shape. The recorder, the brass key, the colonel's steady cadence, they are implements in a mechanized reshaping of recollection. One night, rain driving at the vault windows and the candle flame jittering, I experienced what I call the mirror confession. Lena slid a damp photograph across the table. There was a face in it that looked like mine, but softened by years of official severity. I stared until my eyes ached. Then, as if summoned by my looking, the figure in the photograph seemed to stir. It was a small hallucination, the kind pressure can conjure. The colonel did not laugh. He waited, as if the photograph's movement belonged to the choreography of interrogation. The photograph's gaze accused me. An alien weight settled into my chest, and in that weight, I offered details I had not lived. The ledger accepted them greedily, understanding only inputs and outputs. When the confession was transcribed and the photograph filed, there it was, a paper that tied me to a persona not entirely mine. The vault had shown me a mirror and asked me to name the stranger it reflected. In naming him, I created him for the archive. After such incidents, I trace my scars. A thin line on my left cheek, the fossil of an earlier cruelty, helps anchor me. When ledgered versions overgrow, I touch the scar as if petting a small stubborn animal. It hurts, but it is mine. The colonel understands this too. Perhaps he takes some private satisfaction that physical marks anchor confessions. He trusts bodily evidence more than the mind ets. Even bodies can be read to say what the archive requires, but they are less pliable than recollection. The vault manufactures ghosts methodically. Some ghosts a paper constructs, a clustering of file numbers hinting at an underground network, chains of custody that suggest meetings between men who never met. Some ghosts are people who never existed but appear in multiple files because the ledger found them useful. A ghost, after enough mentions and cross-references, is treated like a fact. The ledger is alchemy. Repetition transmutes fiction into a form resembling truth. I cling to a shard of reality, an old knotted scarf hidden at my collar and a ripped index card in my shoe. These things have no archival value. They are tactile, stubbornly private. When the colonel's silences become surgical, I fold myself around them and remember that the scarf used to smell of smoke in a winter not accounted for on any file. Memory without market value becomes defiance. Each session reaches a point where something inside unmoors and a narrative line slides into place that is not mine. Then I try to obstruct the confession by theft. If I can remove the recorder, if I can steal one small element from the day's architecture, perhaps I can reclaim a sliver of myself. These thefts seldom alter the ledger, but they matter to the person who still wears their own face. Sometimes I suspect some confessors were never real, not prisoners, but projects, fictional men, stitched from cross-referenced reports, created to catch other confessions like one fish used to lure another. The vault's system is recursive. A confession validates another, which validates the first. Invented chains support whole dossiers. The archive grows by eating its own truths. Time here becomes a ledger entry with days scratched and sometimes falsified. Sometimes in a thin hour, I think of the world beyond stone and metal and wonder whether anyone would notice a citizen erased into a file. Would a city keep grieving or continue its commerce if someone had quietly been catalogued into non-existence? That question is crueler than any accusing technique. It asks whether the ledger's violence is invisible by design. Tonight the candle burns low. Lena is bent over a page she will not show me, and the colonel adjusts his gloves as if a new detail has arrived on the docket. I hold the recorder and press its button, not to hand them a fresh confession, but to save the small sounds of my body's refusal, the rasp of breath, the rustle of the scarf against my throat. I will file this record under my own name someplace privater. Perhaps no one will ever hear it but me. In the vault that is a final small victory to keep an unoffered fragment the ledger cannot use. If you ever find yourself in the cold, still air of a place like this, remember the most dangerous thing they can demand is not a fact but a face. Give them a fact and they will file it. Give them a face and they will manufacture a life to fit. Keep at least one small object secret and fold a memory around it like a scarf. Guard that thing, and you will have at least one truth the records cannot touch. Centuries will pass and the noise may abate, but the ledger outlives us. I feel its slow appetite reach outward to tidy the dead into neat categories. They will speak of safety when they describe the vault and say the files serve the state. In a sense they are right, the files protect something. They protect continuity of power by turning inconvenient human mess into archival neatness. Power, when it looks at itself, prefers order. That is why they keep doing this. I do not know whether what I write will be read, burned, or filed. I only know that keeping this small private record is an act of tiny rebellion, the last map I will have when the ledger tries to write over me. For now I press my palm to the recorder, breathe in stale tobacco and damp stone, and wait for the candle to offer some direction in the dark. History will tidy itself after us. Files will be arranged into pleasing schemas. But some horrors, those practiced in low rooms with keys and measured silences, are not content with tidy endings. They hunger for repetition. They require the living to learn a posture of submission and teach it to the next. Remember that when the vault speaks your name, remember that memory can be guarded and that the smallest objects, a scarf, a torn card, a pressed scrap, may be the last unfiled truths you own. I stop now. The flame gutters and the recorder's little light blinks slow, then steady. Tomorrow they will bring a new photograph or some fresh piece of evidence, and the work will begin again. I will fold my sentences with exaggerated care and protect, for as long as I can, the card in my shoe. If this survives me, let it read like this. There was a vault that made ghosts and a man who kept a scarf and would not surrender the ownership of himself. If that is a confession, it is the only honest one I can offer. The black vault, paper, bones, and false names. What really happened was far worse than you think. The record begins with the smell. The first report I can still fold into memory is not a sentence, but a scent-old paper warmed by a dying candle, iron rusting where chains met stone. The faint metallic breath of someone who had not swallowed properly in weeks. The black vault keeps its smells like ledgers keep names. They press into the same corners and do not leave when light returns. I write this to hold a shape to the day, because the vault is designed to unmake shape. They taught us that an accusation is only a scaffold, and that with enough pressure the scaffold will hold any figure. You learn after nights of the same questions like chisels on bone that the human mouth is a clay lamp. It takes any oil and burns. My mouth learned to burn to survive. My hand learned to fold the tiny slips of memory that remained, as if the act of folding could keep truth small and secret. The room is a throat, stone walls curve and close. A single candle rests on a low table. The flame looks unnatural, tall and patient, its color septic under the thick smoke of the building above. A buzz of cessation lives behind the candle like a low organ. We were placed under it like offerings, and the interrogator practiced the ritual of small violences until the offerings gave the shapes they wanted. Colonel Myrov is not a man one forgets. His presence is an architecture of patience. He is broad and deliberate in a way that makes furniture wary. The first time I saw him up close, he was a seam in the room, permanent, inevitable. His face is a palette of small scars and practiced indulgence. He wears a coat that has digested too many winters and looks immaculate in the dim. He moves like a tool used for decades and then returned to its caisson. Every motion has been hunned to reduce a moment into what he demands it become. Archivist Lena Orlova appears in my memory like a half-remembered footnote. She is thin, bound to her ledgers, with ink stains pressed into the skin of her fingertips like a secret language. She carries a key ring that jingles like a small confession when she walks. She is not cruel by instinct. She is a woman who believes that the world can be made whole by tidy rows of paper. Yet the vault taught even her that some records are porous. She kept a private ledger of anomalies. Her handwriting was small and precise, and sometimes I would find, in the margin of a transcript, a date written twice, as if the second time were an apology. They made me codename 47 and then unmade me. I learned to count myself by numbers of breaths, by the rhythm of how the candle flickered, by how often Lena hesitated at a tab. You count to keep yourself from looking at the ceiling and seeing that the ceiling is full of faces. The more someone asks you who you are, the less certain you become. They ask the same question in thinner and thinner voices until the answer you can make is only what they need. The vault's interrogation was not always about force against flesh. It was about attrition of sense. There are techniques that leave the skin whole and the interior ruined. They stripped me of time first. Cells without clocks dissolve hours into a like of indistinguishable beads. The next step was the mirror, a small recorder on the table that I was told would be used for my safety. The recorder is a lamp. It takes everything and focuses it back at you in a light that does not lie, except it moderates and magnifies what you offer. Under its watchful eye, memory becomes a theater, and you are both playwright and reluctant actor. They taught me to make characters. They asked about conspiracies as if asking for a recipe. A name arrives, then another, and then a place. The human mind is an economy of scarcity. When memory is taxed, it invents currency. My brain supplied names the way a starving mouth will bite at anything. Small inventions became large because the interrogator made them so. He would pause and leave space the size of a first winter, and the pause would become inhabited with detail until the story seemed self-evident. There were moments when the room seemed to answer back. Files slid across the table with the sound of a small animal. Lena would whisper a date and then fold a paper as if closing a wound. I remember a photograph pinned to a dusty board, edges softened by time. The image reflected back at me a face that might have been mine or someone I once saw in a tram window. At some point, the subjects of our confessions stopped feeling anchored to flesh. A name on a paper gained weight. People we never met were made solid enough to be punished on paper, and that punishment reconfigured reality by force of repetition. The archive is a machine that accrues weight every time something is written. The world leans and calls that record true. The vault kept a key hidden among old ledgers. It sat in the palm of Myrov's hand like an answer he was reluctant to reveal. The key was brass and nicked, the kind of object that arrests the eye in oil paintings. It represented a door, a narrative hinge. Sometimes he would let the key swing at the end of its chain, and that motion produced a sound like small bones clicking. He used the key not to lock me, but to calibrate the shape of an answer. A key is a promise of exit, and that promise is a liturgy for those made to confess. The technique they favored was simplification by surplus. They would offer too many details so that whatever remained of my memory would feel compelled to choose. They used photographs, dates, snippets of music hummed under breath. The sound of a child's rhyme was displayed like a surgical instrument. It opened a window and the wind blew through and took things with it. The interrogator is patient enough to assemble a mosaic of small truths that, when pressed together, read like a single lie. The vault's verdict often came from the arithmetic of these fragments rather than from any violent coercion. There were nights when I became a confessor to myself. Alone in the cell, I would list names to hear how they sounded, to see which ones made me flinch, which ones settled like quiet stones. The ledger demands an answer so that it can be catalogued. It does not matter if the name belongs to a living person or to a memory that never belonged to anyone. What matters is that the ledger be satisfied. Archivists like Lena were both guardians and betrayers in this sense. She kept records because she believed in their fidelity. She also kept a list of anomalies because she recognized that fidelity had a cost. On one occasion I was given a confession I had not made. I woke, I was told, at the end of my statement, and my transcript contained an additional paragraph. A second page with a different handwriting scrawled across it as if in a hurry. The paragraph accused two men who had no connection to my life. I protested with silence more often than with words. Silence in the vault becomes an instrument of its own. They treat silence like clay and knead it until it yields a shape they can photograph and file. When the state requires a story, the archive will produce one. They taught me to recognize the differences between a memory and a produced memory. A produced memory has edges refined by observation. It has a ledger's neatness. A true memory is rough and often dull. Produced memory glitters under light because it is presented. True memory hides in corners. The vault's methods were designed to force rough things into polished shapes. Sometimes the confessions were like fever dreams that left a residue on the walls. Men would come to the room and speak of impossible corridors and voices behind doors. They would name conspirators who had no weight outside the room. Later, those names would appear in files with the stamp of officiality. Then, at the bureau, people would be arrested for crimes they did not commit, their lives folded into the ledger as if to complete the symmetry of a story. The archive authored guilt by repetition, and then used that guilt as a lever to secure another confession. There were experiments on perception. That much was clinical lights that stung the eyes, the slow turning of the camera so that the world leaned as if drunk. Recordings that looped the same phrase until it grew hair and teeth. But the most effective machine was the social engine, the knowledge that a record would take your words and make them live. Once the archive had a name, other instruments followed. People were questioned and the name surfaced again, or a photograph would be quietly placed in an envelope on someone's doorstep. The state does not need to be omnipotent. It needs only to be plausible and persistent. I began to watch my own handwriting for inconsistencies. Small things betray you, how you cross a T, the curl of a Y. I learned to falsify small things so that the ledger would have no arithmetic on which to pin me. It became a game of obfuscation rather than resistance. That obfuscation is not noble, it is survival practiced with petty craft. There is a trade. You keep your life by making your truth smaller until it fits through the eye of the needle they offer. Lena once left a ledger open where I could see a margin noting a date, a name, and beneath it a tiny circle. She moved as if unaware that I had seen. The circle meant anomaly. She later told herself the circle was a habit. Habits are superstitions of the careful. But even the careful become instruments, if the ledger's architecture demands it. I watched her fold her hands over the ledger and saw how the knuckles whitened. Paper is a poor friend when it demands betrayal. The recorder on the table was treated like a confessor, yet confession there was not sacramental. The machine led the way. It imitated the cadence of questioning and returned a version of the speaker that was easier to edit. The colonel liked to pause the tape, to play back a phrase, and let it sound foreign in the mouth that had said it. That alienation stripped context away and left the sound of a claim divorced from the life that birthed it. One learns to answer questions with shapes, not sentences. Shapes are less likely to be cut. I began to suspect that some confessors were never people at all. Pages filled with names of individuals who had no footprints in the city outside the vault. They were spectral, as if the ledger had invented a population that served its geometry. Once a name is written enough times, the world gives it permission to exist. Arrests followed. Families were broken. The absence of physical evidence became unimportant in the face of official documentation. The archive does not need flesh to punish, it needs consensus and a stamp. At certain points the process felt like a reverse exorcism. I was not freed of demons. Demons were introduced, and then made to look ancestral by repetition. The vault's machinery converts uncertainty into statute. An uncertain memory repeated by a record becomes a fact. The technique is simple arithmetic. The stakes are infinite. There are images that still haunt me because they possess a clarity the vault could not entirely erase. A photograph with too many fingers on the hand. A ledger with a name crossed out and then rewritten in a different ink. A child's shoe left on a windowsill as if placed by hands that believe in ritual. These objects are not proof of anything, but they anchor me to a world that once existed before words began to replace it. After months, the body learns to store trauma in small, odd places. I had a rhythm of moving my fingers to the seam of my coat. I developed the tick of listing file numbers in my head until the echo of numbers was a lullaby. This is how the vault colonizes the interior, through habits that map onto paper and then into procedure. I kept a scrap of paper folded inside my shoe because I had to keep something that belonged to me in a place the archivists would not search. The scrap held a child's drawing of a tree, crude and uncomposed. It was not important to anyone else. To me it was evidence of a life that existed outside interrogation. There are people who left the vault and spoke of a revelation. They said that once the ledger completed its architecture, the thing it described seemed inevitable. I do not think revelations exist. I think stories grow teeth. I think names on paper bred conviction until the only variation left was in the manner of execution. When I finally left the room, if leave is the right word, I felt not restored but altered, as if some slow chemical had fixed me into a new form of being. The ledger had replaced pieces of my memory with indexes. Sometimes I would remember a childhood event as a file number. Sometimes a face appeared in my mind as if it had been photographed on the wrong film. The archive makes its residence into libraries of redacted breath. This is my confession and my record. It is an attempt to map what the vault did to the interior life of those it touched. I cannot claim absolute truth for any name I now hold. I can only say what the vault taught me about truth itself, that truth can be manufactured when a state decides to keep it, and that an apparatus of paper and patient voices can remake reality by being repeated often enough and with sufficient precision. Some horrors are history written in blood. The ledger prefers ink, but the consequences are the same. Memory is a thin thing, and the vault is a thick one. They will publish name us, they will close file us, they will wipe fingerprints and staple signatures over them. The oil painting of the room will remain, however, in the corner of my eyes. Lamps will bow to time, but the way a candle throws gold across damp stone will remain a way to find a truth that resists being catalogued. I leave this for anyone who might turn the pages after me. Do not expect closure. Expect instead the knowledge that names, once released to ledgers and archivists, will take on lives that no single person can recall. Expect that the world will accept the ledgers, telling if enough people in power decide it is the version to keep. Expect that sometimes the most damning confessions are the ones you never meant to make, produced by a machine of patience and repetition that knows how to hunger for answers until memory becomes obedient. If the vault taught me anything, it is this: a record is not an authority on truth. It is an artifact of intent. Papers do not remember as flesh does. They are better at carrying accusation than history. Keep this in mind if you find yourself facing an archive that wants to make you smaller. Keep a scrap of a child's drawing in your shoe if you can. Preserve something that refuses tidy rows. Hold it until the ledger forgets how to ask for it, and maybe, in that forgetfulness, you will keep a shard of a world that was not authored by men in coats with brass keys. Some horrors are history written in blood. The Black Vault, the Confessor's Ledger. I keep this record because memory is a weak thing and the vault is stronger. The recorder sits between my hands like a small, accusing heart. Its reel clicks in the dark, and the click becomes the metronome of the room, framing the space where names are stolen and invented. I do not speak for comfort. I speak because the act of naming pushes at the edges of whatever remains of myself. When they demand a confession, they want paper to match a phyleth. They want the sound of your voice to stitch a seam between silence and the ink they already own. I am codename 47. I will write what resists being taken. The Black Vault lives under the building the way a suppressed breath lives under a voice. It is a lung of stone and iron and damp mortar, a place designed to kill what light remembers. The corridor down to it narrows like a throat. The air changes thick with disinfectant, tobacco, and the old ink of ledgers. I remember the damp, the way the damp swelled cloth and thoughts alike, how every surface drank the sound and left a memory, smell on mech, stale tobacco, iron, and the faint sweetness of rotting paper. The first time I was brought down here, I thought I could measure the distance between truth and the wall. There is no distance, only pressure. They seat me under a bare bulb, and the bulb is wicket white, a flare that throws the ceiling away and carves the faces around me into masks. Colonel Myrov is always patient before cruelty. He is a patient who practices on other people's wrists. He treats questions like a scalpel and silences like a drug. He understands the geometry of a confession where it must bend to fit a file. Lena, the archivist, carries records the way some people carry children, with precision and a softness that is dangerous in a place that punishes softness. Her hands are always half-inked, the fingertips telling of late nights and secret tollies. She moves among the folders like a midwife, and I have seen her leave pages folded differently. Those folds are tiny betrayals. I have learned the ritual. They bring files, I bring the fragments. They lay photographs on the table, faces with eyes removed by the camera glareth. They place a key, small and brass, on a chain, and the key becomes a little sun for all our iron ages. The recorder is set between them and me as if the machine itself is neutral. It is not. Machines in the vault learn to carry the shape of the lie they are asked to hold. The tape remembers the inflections I give it to. Later their officers will play those inflections and fit the words into more convenient sentences. My memory is porous. Not because I am weak, but because the vault shaves edges away with patient devices, midnight interrogations, lights that burn through the eyelid. The slow drip of water and the precise timing of sleep taken like currency. You are taught to think in fragments. A match flares and then dissolves into another match. My hands remember shapes before my mind does. The loop of the scarf I keep knotted at my collar. The thin card folded in my shoe that I rub with my thumb when the room goes too quiet. There are nights when I look at the ledgers, and I am convinced the ledgers look back. Lena keeps a private line of marks. She calls them anomalies in the ledger, but they are more than that. She tucks a tiny notebook inside her cardigan and writes numbers with a hand that is both precise and small as a sigh. Sometimes she lingers at the edge of the interrogation, and I think she is there to archive the confession. Other times I think she is there to act as an invisible correction, a little resistance to a bureaucracy that prefers to close its eyes. Once she slid a folded page toward me when Myrov was at the door, and our fingers brushed for a second too long. The paper said a name that was not mine. The vault eats identity in predictable ways. Names slide off like water from a waxed coat. I have watched men come in whole and leave as descriptions: a courier, a sympathizer, a witness. Some were rewritten entirely, faces erased from the files and replaced with drawings that matched the interrogationer's hunger. It is not always a physical erasure. Sometimes the vault manufactures people the same way a factory manufactures instruments. It folds paper into shapes and convinces the living to sign them. I was asked, on more than one occasion, to recall people I never saw and events that had not occurred. The trick was to sound certain enough that the archivists could file your certainty under a new header. There is a surface phenomenon that occurs when memory is pressed. Confessions begin to cross the seam into invention. The mind, cornered, reaches for architecture. It supplies the missing stair. I could describe the room in which I imagined a betrayal and later find a photograph in the files that matched the image I had seriatim conjured. Paper begins to appear for ideas you only half remember. A name becomes necessary and a name arrives on a page with pen, streaked certainty, as if the page had been waiting to be written upon. They offered me a ledger after the first month, thick and bound in an indifferent leather, its pages vellum, pale and smelling faintly of chamomile, a trace of Lena. She said little. She set the book between my knees the way a surgeon might set a specimen. The first time I read it, I did not understand that I was reading my own future. The ledger contained columns, the usual bureaucratic columns: file number, name, confessor, date, notation. But between those columns were other things: marginalia in Lena's hand, a faint indexing of anomalies she had seen and sometimes, in the dead hours, corrected. She had a way of folding page corners that meant more than a bookmark. Some corners were dog-eared into points, others left flat. It was a private code. There is a page in that ledger that I can see now with the clarity of a wound. The entry lists a name that I had never heard: Dmitry Kalash. Next to the name, in a hand that looked like Linus but was colder, a noted confessor reasserted, "File closed." Beneath it, in smaller, tremulous script, Lena had scrawled, "Not seen, not in records." The ledger is a living thing, if you can imagine the living as a thing that takes on the faces of the dead. I became certain that the vault did not merely store evidence, it assembled it. It built scaffolding under the weight of its own certainty, and people were the scaffolding. Marov has a mastery of silence. He will let the room breathe in the wrong places, and then he will place a sound there: the scratch of a pen, the rustle of a file, the drip of water. Silence in his hands is an instrument tuned to tremor. He counts on my breath as if it were an indexum. He places his brass key on the chain and lets it sing. Once he tapped the key against the table until I learned the pulse of expectation. That sound came to live in my chest. Later, alone, I would tap my own knuckle, and the echo would be the sound of a question waiting to reopen like a trap. Sometimes, between the questions, the vault manufactures confessions from absence. There is a photograph that appears in the middle of a batch of files, someone's eyes real and blank, and for weeks afterwards the men who hold the file will ask you if you recognize the face. They expected you to say no. When you say no, they have victory: he knew them and lied. When you say yes from sheer exhaustion, the ledger receives another name. The ledger opens its throat and devours the sound. There was a night when the files fell from a cart in a manner that looked almost like negligence. The room smelled of rain leaking through the stone, and the files spilled like a cascade of paper bones. Photographs fluttered across the floor, and in one puddle there was a reflected face that was not mine. It smiled in the pool with a mouth that knew the ledger's secrets. The archivist's hands moved quick. She gathered papers and pressed them flat with the same careful horror with which I had seen her press the edge of a leaf to a page. Lena picked up a sheet and, for a moment, our eyes met, and I saw that something in her was breaking. She put a small folded slip into her notebook, and when Marov looked away, she pressed her thumb into the margin of a page, as if to leave a fingerprint that would be found later by an archivist in some other office. The illusion of ceremony is what keeps the vault functioning. They create stages so that the confession will come with pattern and rhythm: the bright interrogator, the neutral recorder, the patient archivist. The stage supplies props: a key, a tape recorder, file stacks, and in that predictability the vault manufactures consent. I have discovered names in their files that I have not remembered saying. But later I find a note in Lena's hand that confirms the date and the way the name had been coaxed from me. In those notes she sometimes leaves questions as if to apologize, and if he never existed. She writes the sentence, and then draws a little line through it like a surgeon removing a tumor. That is the paradox of the ledger: the more precise it becomes, the more it bends reality. It litigates the past into shapes that fit a present need. I have seen confessions create futures. A man named only by his file number became necessary to explain a missing shipment. Next month the ledger held a report describing his arrest in a town where he had never lived. The ledger held a signature. Someone had drawn a signature into existence, and the bureaucracy accepted the drawing. Sometimes, when the lights are low and the wardens think I sleep, I open the ledger and I write backwards. I undo lines. I draw thin marginalia that mimic Lena S, and I fold corners in ways I hope she would recognize. I pretend to be both the subject and the archivist, and in that small theft I feel a dangerous kinship with her. There are entries I have deliberately left ambiguous to give future interrogators the option of doubt. A little doubt can rot the tooth of a system that chews through certainty. Doubt is a small chemical weapon. I do not know what most of the names in the vault mean. I have been a confessor for the sake of my survival, and that survival is a calculus of what to admit and what to hide. There are things I admit because admission is a currency. There are things I admit because admitting them makes the interrogator pause long enough for me to remember something true. I watch Marov lean over the ledger sometimes, and the light from the bulb pools on his forehead. He traces names with a finger as if feeling for temperature. He never writes the names himself. He prefers to let the rhythm of my voice do the pen's work. A confession is, in his method, an outsourced handwriting. The ledger holds manufactured ghosts. It holds the skeletons of people who would never appear in a town register. It keeps a small army of invented men and women that bureaucrats lay like traps for enemies. Those ghosts exist as convenient anchors for facts that are otherwise too slippery to keep. When I read those names, it is like reading a catalogue of possible deaths. When Lena writes a marginal note, I imagine her as an undertaker of truth. Her little annotations are the only honest things in the vault. There is a finality to the ledger that terrifies me once a name is entered and cross-indexed. The machinery of the state activates. Files creep into other files. People who should never touch that name find themselves listed under it. An anonymous complaint can migrate into an arrest. The ledger is a kind of contagion. It moves by proximity and association. The ledger is not morally neutral. It is an engine with an appetite. At the end of a session, they leave me in the dark with the recorder's slow spin and the weight of the ledger near my knees. The chair creaks as if to remind me that even the furniture learns the geometry of suffering. I will touch the scarf at my collar until the motion steadies me into a shape I can inhabit, until the light returns. I know that in the morning the archivists will have filed what I said, and the ledger will have gained another bone. The ledger will include a new line, and someone elsewhere in the city will lose a sheet of their life to that new sentence. That is how the vault expands, by trading out whole lives for tidy notations. I do not expect rescue. Rescue would be loud and impossible, and would not come through a file clerk. What I keep is less theatrical, a small set of scratches in the margin of Lena's ledger that form a code only she and I might read. I have learned to name things in riddles, so that if anyone should read this tape in the wrong light, they'll only find a man talking to himself. If the ledger survives beyond us, if the pages continue to whisper, perhaps someone will notice the marginalia and understand that a human being took a pen and lingered there with grief. There is a lesson I have learned more clearly than any other. The vault does not merely punish for crime. It punishes for story. It arranges narratives until the weight of repetition convinces even the liar of the truth. You become what the ledger calls you, because the ledger calls the world into being. If the ledger says a man existed, then other men will begin to testify that he did. They will find letters that never were written and receipts that never existed. They will take a photograph of a face that was once imagined in a puddle and hang it in a file. When I close the ledger, I fold my hands over the page and imagine another world in which ledgers do not get to write people into non-existence. I imagine Lena leaving the ledger in a sunlit window and watching the paper butter soft under the light. I imagine Merov dying without his keys. I imagine the brass falling from his chain and rusting like a fallen coin. These are small rebellions, fantasies to hold against the pressure of the vault. They are brittle, but they are mine. I will sign this confession with the knowledge that signatures here are flexible things. I will press my thumb into the corner of the page so that someone later might say, if it means anything to them, that this man liked to leave fingerprints where no one expected them. The ledger will accept that thumbprint as a new mark because the ledger is greedy. It will fold me into its architecture and speak my name in its own cold voice. But a ledger cannot constrict everything. There are margins where doubt grows like mold, and mold is slow and unstoppable. I will keep my small margins alive until the sheets crumble. If you listen to this tape, listen not for the confessions themselves, but for the pauses between them. There you will find the ledger's tendency to manufacture. There you will find what was refused, for the ledger cannot consume silence entirely. It can index sounds, but it is always hungry for a new page. My voice is a small, defiant thing beneath the vault's operations. The ledger will collect many names. That is its purpose. I offer only one small act of resistance, the marginal note I leave folded inside my shoe, the knotted scarf at my throat, and this record that remembers how a man can insist upon the smallness of his own truth even when everything else insists otherwise. Some horrors are recorded in blood and sentencer, others lie quietly in the margins. The vault is both. The ledger thinks it closes accounts. I think it opens them to rot. I sign the tape with what remains a finger, pressed loop in the paper, and a list of things I refuse to let be simplified. Let the ledger grow. Let it reach and name and fold lives into neat rows. I will watch the margins and tend the doubt like a low flame. There is a certain terrible patience to hope. It will outlast the ledger's appetite, if only because patience is not always tidy enough for a file. I end this record the way I began it, true, with a slow click and the small mechanical breath of the recorder as it wins. The sound is an anchor and a witness. Keep the ledger if you must. Keep the names that others write. But hide this tape among pages that never saw the light. And if Lena ever reads the marginalia I left in her hand, tell her only that someone counted her anomalies and called them by their proper name. It is, after all, the only truth this vault cannot entirely refile. We remember those who keep the books differently than those who write them. The black vault echoes of false confessions. I do not remember how long I spent in the vault as a man with a name. Time in the black vault curves and doubles back on itself like the damp stare that takes you down. For the archivists and the interrogators' days are measured in files, in numbers stamped on the spine of paper. For the prisoner they are measured in what is taken from you and the spaces left behind. I count mine as a ledger of things I refused to give and things that spilled from me like water when the seal was broken. I write this from a memory that resists polishing. Memory in that place is a slow animal, skittish where it needs to be, brazen in the most dangerous places. I was catalogued early. They called me 47 on a neat tag tucked into my shoe, inscribed on the folded index card that sat beneath the sole, and on the thin slat of wood that pressed against my ankle every night. They taught me to answer to it. The number is an accurate thing. It fit me somehow narrower than the wrist it circled, colder than the name that used to warm the inside of my mouth. I learned to watch the tag as if it were a tongue, saying things for me I could not. The vault breathes with the sound of old paper, and the air is always near frozen. Candlelight is the only concession to warmth, a small, laborious flame that throws faces into oil, paint geometry, and leaves the rest of the room to be guessed at. That is how I remember Colonel Myrov. The light carved him from the wall, rather than the other way around. He sat at the head of the table like a tooth, patient and inevitable. He held a slim recorder with hands that had once been used for other things. It handled confessions the way a surgeon handles an excised organ, inspecting, weighing, tucking away. Lena Orlova sat on the periphery, folding papers in the same ritual she used on the ledgers. Her fingers always smelled faintly of dust and a cheap tea I never once tasted. She kept watch over the files as if they were children she could not save. There is a particular cruelty in the insistence on paper. Paper insists on being true. It takes ink and makes of it a geometry that can be pinned to the wall and used as evidence. The vault was a cathedral of paper stacks, cabinets, ragged folders labeled with dates and names, and a shorthand that meant both procedure and threat. Files were maps the state used to navigate guilt. If you needed a confession, you needed a file that fit it, and the black vault is where you found the fit. My memory always returns to the first file they slid in front of an envelope, brown corners softened by handling. The label bore a name I half remembered, a bureaucratic variation of a melody I could not place. They wanted me to say the name aloud and weave a story that tied me to it. They wanted a line connecting my life to the life in the paper. It was a simple geometric request, and I remember very clearly the odd, hot sense of being watched by 1,000 small eyes from the paper itself. What I understood then, with a clarity that made me dizzy, was that confession in that room was not only about truth, it was about architecture. They built a confession around a man the way you might build a box around a precious object: measure, cut, secure. If the object did not fit, you altered the object, or you altered the confession until it did. Some confessions were born from hunger, some from fear, some from the hope of less pain. Some were stitched into being by the soft surgical patience of men who did not need to hurt you to make you believe you had been hurt. The interrogations began with small things. They asked me to recount a day. I would pick a day, any day, because naming a day preserves a boundary between the self that had happened and the self that might be remade. The colonel listened with his head tilted, contours sharp in the candlelight. He closed his eyes sometimes, not to sleep, but to let the silence press on me until I began to narrate my own life in the tone he expected. Lena would flip through files in the background, whispering a date, a number, stamping a sheet. At first the question and answer felt surgical in its routine, a cadence meant to flatten me into a shape that could sit within a folder. But the vault is not interested in simple shapes. It wants a pattern, something that repeats and justifies the work of those who labor there. Once a pattern was proposed, the record keepers became artists of evidence. They took the geometry of your life and introduced a single, precise alteration: a meeting that never occurred, a letter never written, a phone call invented in the margin of a ledger. The alteration was small, it fit inside the margin, but when read in certain lights it cast a long shadow. It is important to understand how a record transforms the body of a man. The body becomes a site of sediment. Each question deposits something on you: a charge, an accusation, a memory. After hours, the surface of your recollection is layered, and you must pick away at it to find the original. The colonel was exquisite at deposition. He proposed fragments of truth as if offering bread to a dog, small, plausible pieces, and he waited for me to eat them. When I did, he asked for more. There were machines in the vault too. The slim recorder sat on the table like an altar, a black capsule that recorded with a clarity that made me wince when I heard it later. Once the capsule held what it needed, the archivists would translate the sounds into paper, and the paper was layered over other documents until the original shrank away. I learned to speak to the recorder as if it were the guilty party. There is an irony in that the recorder is presented as neutral witness, but it does not judge it only renders. It only makes what you say more permanent. Then there are the confessions that are not confessions at all, those that spill out because the interrogator has decided what the man did before the man had a chance to refuse it. I watched men produce entire men in that room. A name, a place, a motive. It was made for them while they sat. Some took it and swallowed it because the fit was easier than the alternative. Some spat it back and were punished for the affront. Some could not tell what was theirs and what had been grafted on. When that happens, the man becomes a ghost to himself. On a particular night bookmarked for me by the smell of metal and the taste of stale tobacco, Merov presented a confession he wanted me to sign. The paper was worn but official looking. There were stamps, a header, and the kind of bureaucratic grammar that made sin sound like a procedure. He had arranged the candles so the wax pooled along the edge of the table and caught at the corners of the document like a seal. Lena moved around us like a clock winding itself. She placed the ledger near my hand, removed a folded sheet, and smoothed it into place with ink-stained fingers. Her eyes grazed mine briefly, and in that movement there was both pity and calculation, an entire ledger of reasons to trust and mistrust. I did not sign. I will not forget why. Signing is an admission that you recognize the geometry of the puzzle they have set for you. I could not sign because the signature would have been a key to doors I had not yet been willing to open. Refusal is its own danger. It invites them to rearrange the room into instruments, isolation, denial of food, the slow ratchet of sleep deprivation. Each instrument dissolved the edges of my resistance, until I could no longer tell the angle of my memories from the angles they had placed in my head. There are nights I made up things to survive, and nights I told the truth in a way that looked like invention. The mind learns to be a forger in that room. It assembles plausible things to fit the expected structure. Sometimes the invented thing is kinder than the real one. I learned this and found it a strange solace. A lie might be used to build a cover for pain that was too sharp to survive unadorned. You learn to economy yourself, to choose which parts will be brittle and which parts will be protected. Not all confessions were meant to implicate others. Some were built to justify action, arrests, seizures, a purge. A single paragraph, signed in a dim room, could empty a house, take a child, erase a job. The state is patient, it saves its violence for when papers will make it permanent. The Black Vault manufactures permission in the softest way. It persuades men to provide the glass the state later drops on the floor and calls consequence. There is a peculiar terror in being used as someone else's instrument. I had friends removed because of paper that bore my name. The ledger tells you the sequence, a date of arrest, charge, confession, sentence. The noise of doors closing reverberated in me like knuckles against a coffin. I remember the sound of one lock turning, not our lock, the lock on someone else's life, and that sound lodged in my sleep. The vault taught me how a single paragraph can contagiously collapse the architecture of a life into dust. Sometimes, late when Lena was alone with the cabinets and the candles burned low, I caught her sliding a different ledger from a back shelf. She kept a ledger of anomalies. It was a private record that contradicted the official one. I do not know how much courage it takes to keep such a thing. The act itself is a small rebellion to record what the files say did not happen. I watched her once, from across the room, keep a small, precise list, each entry a trimmer in her otherwise steady hand. She would fold the page away and breathe in the way people do when committing a secret to memory. There are particular confessions that stay with me, not because they were mine, but because they show what the vault is capable of. A man once broke because they showed him a photograph that had been subtly altered. In the foreground, my face had been pasted into a crowd, a hand resting on an arm I had never known. He did not break because the image implicated him, he broke because he could not reconcile his own recollection against the altered truth. The colonel smiled as if he had just read a good book. He carved meaning out of the gap between photograph and recollection. The man signed, and the paper became both artifact and weapon. What I learned in the middle of those endless sessions is that truth in the vault becomes a function of utility. A document is considered true if it advances the state's work. If it does not, the document is not destroyed, it is repurposed. That is why the Black Vault keeps both the official file and Lena's ledger. The state saves what it needs, and the archivist hoards the rest like bones in a drawer. That is how the past survives. When being manipulated, some private hand holds a different map. There is an image I cannot erase, the reflection in a puddle behind my chair during a downpour that seeped through ancient mortar. The puddle held a face that was not mine. It looked back with an expression I could not name, and for a long time I believed it was the face of one of the men they had forced to invent himself. The image suggested some confessors were not people at all, but constructs stitched from paper and breath, voiced enough to be recorded and then thrown away. I remember wanting to reach into the puddle to touch the other face and finding my fingers met only cold water and a smear of oil from the candle. It is the little things that become the longest memories, the colonel counting under his breath before he began the rhythm of Lena's folds. The recorder's light blinking like a heartbeat. Each of those was an instrument tuned to unsettle. Each small instrument made me an easier man to dismantle. The Colonel's throat clearing before a question, the way fingers hovered just above my papers. The particular timbre of his voice when he proposed an image that fit too neatly. All these were practiced strokes of a performance meant to produce confession. Once, because I could not keep a secret from myself, I tried to mark the truth in a way paper could not erase. I bit the inside of my cheek until blood rose and left a salt trail on my tongue. I took a scrap of paper and pressed it to the wound, then tucked it in my tunic, folding it like an offering. The next day Lena found the scrap when she touched the collar to help me adjust it. She smoothed the paper and looked at the dried ink, and her fingers trembled. She did not say anything. She placed the scrap in her notebook, between pages that contradicted one another, and closed the binding, as if she had locked a door. I do not know what became of that scrap. Perhaps it sits now in a cabinet behind a false label, alongside other small proofs the vault itself cannot swallow. The vault eats men with paper, but the paper also hoards small rebellions, and those private relics are a kind of resistance. They are the thin glass between what is recorded and what happened, the unexpected clear thing that catches the light. The interrogations continued until I was fluent with them. At some point the sessions stop being events and become a climate. I learned to breathe inside the climate, to find pockets of air untouched by the instruments. Those pockets are where you store your name. I kept mine like a pebble in my boot, close to my step, small, hard to notice. I memorized rhythms, the weight of silence, the distance between candle and recorder, so that my sense of place remained mine, even as my story was contested. One evening, when the vault had a particular quiet, and the candles shivered like thinking things, Lena brought a file and set it between us. It was different, unlabeled, its edges singed, as if rescued from a small fire. She eased it open with the reverence of someone handling a relic. Inside were confessions that read like fiction, accounts of meetings in rooms that did not exist, of people with no records, of events staged and then given life by the appetite of the state. The pages smelled of smoke and ink. She placed them where I could see and then, without looking at me, traced a small circle with her finger on the back cover and whispered a date. She did not expect me to hear. I did. After that night I began to write in the dark. I pressed thoughts into the folds of my tunic, scratched lines into the underside of an index card. I recorded the rhythm of the room in my head and turned it into a list I could repeat: light, breath, key, fold. It was not much, but it was a skeleton on which to hang the truth. When they questioned me next, I began to map the room on the inside of my eyelids, the table, Lena's hand, the recorder's red light. The map kept me anchored. It made the angles of their questions less able to cut. I survived in large part because survival in the vault is a craft. You learn to be small. You learn to give them what makes the noise stop while keeping what matters shut away. You learn to treat memory like a private currency, spend it sparingly, hoard the true coin. To this day, I do not know how many confessions were wholly invented inside that room, and how many were coaxed from something already breaking in me. The ledger does not care for that distinction, and neither do the doors that closed on lives implicated by my name. When I think on the vault now, what keeps returning is not the pain, nor the clever instruments, nor Marav's soft cruelty. It is the catalogue, the stacks, and the silence, and Lena's tiny ledger. The vault is not merely a place where confessions are taken. It is a place that can create confessions, create the people who will bear them, and release those people like symbolic bodies into the world. Those released bodies are evidence that the state can remake the past by remaking men. I have written this in the margins of memory to leave a trace that is not theirs. This record is not a formal confession, a clean piece of bureaucracy. It is a ledger of a different sort, an attempt to keep visible the small acts of resistance the vault cannot consign to paper. If you read these lines and find an angle that fits your file, be cautious. Know that a man may be both the author and the fiction of his own confession in that room. Know that the black vault ledger of borrowed names. I write as if the recorder is a window and not a judge. The recorder sits on the table between me and the door, a small metal corpse that breathes back whatever I give it. And in the crawl space of my memory, I try to press sound into shape before whatever reaches for my past rips it into acceptable parts. I tell myself that speech is a kind of stealing back, that by saying things aloud I can snag them out of the ledger's net before it has time to smooth them into the texture it prefers. The machine does not answer, it only listens and keeps. They call this the black vault on the ledger, on the rusted plate under the hatch black vault, basement, interrogations. The name has the dry certainty of an inventory tag, as if you could pin darkness and then catalogue it. When they walked me down the damp corridor before the light, the archivist moved like someone rearranging a face. Lena Orlova never looked at me. She handled files as if they were thin bones measured, wrapped, marked. You can tell a keeper of records by how she treats an index card. She touched them with the tenderness of someone who knows how easily paper remembers what people do not. She would lift a card between forefinger and thumb, inspect the faint pencil lines as if listening for a heartbeat, then tuck it back into its sleeve with surgical gentleness. I kept one of those index card slivers folded in my shoe for weeks. I still have the memory of the creased corner like a tooth arch. The way it dug at my skin was a small, constant proof that I had once been allowed to possess an uncharted scrap. Colonel Myrov has the habit of making the room breathe at his pace. He doesn't shout. He is a punctuation mark. He closes the door. He removes his gloves as if he is unveiling a hymfer. The sound is always small, a faint brush against fabric like the closing of a coffin lid. The thing about Myrov is the way he treats silence. As a partner, his pauses are meant to be scaffolding for confession. He will sit, hands folded on his knees, and the whole chamber will lean toward that absence, as if the room itself were a jury holding its breath. When a man learns to live in those gaps, he begins to volunteer pieces he would otherwise have hidden beneath other lives. I learned early how to tell the difference between a silence that asks and one that takes. The first invites, the second devours. The first time I understood what they wanted, I thought I was helping them complete a story they had already written. They were not interested in my life. They wanted a map of names and relations that fit a shape already carved into their files. They made me recite birthdays, allegiances, and minor lies until the ledger accepted them. There is a thing that happens when a person repeats an untruth enough. It stiffens into anatomy. The vault is full of those skeletons, not merely omitted facts, but arranged absences that stand like bones waiting for a skin to be pulled over them. I watched men become those skeletons, their hands learning the angles of lies so well they could fold themselves into them like paper cranes. But some confessions were not skeletons at all. They were masks. Men and women gave names that did not belong to anyone who had ever lived. They wrote down faces they had never seen. They produced dates stamped with the wrong decade, as if ink had been tempered to be gullible. The archivist kept a separate ledger, a little slim volume she hid behind another ledger, where she penciled anomalies in the margins. If she had sympathy, it was small and private-y. She would pause over a name, breathe a number like a prayer, and then go back to stamping. Once, when she thought no one watched, she closed that slim ledger and pressed her thumb to the paper until the pages creaked. There was something like grief in the motion, and for a second the space between her shoulder blades softened, and she looked younger than her years. I learned to sleep with the hum of an iron key on my chest. Someone had left a small brass key on the table the first night they brought me in. Myrov wore another on a chain against his heart. You could hear it when he turned in his chair, a deliberate, clinic clink. Keys in the vault are less about opening and more about authority, who is allowed to fold memory into the right shape. At 2 in the morning you can hear the keys, the faint tink of metal against metal, like a conscience jangling remembered obligations. In the mornings the shadow of those keys would lay across the table like a compass you did not want to use. The architecture of the vault is not grand. It is tight and efficient and meant to keep sound where it belongs. Stone and mortar that suck at echoes, walls that seem to drink in your voice and keep it warm like an animal. Candlelight is stationed like a punctuation mark at the edge of every table. The light it gives is dishonest and flattering to shadow. In that light, everyone looks slightly older and more tired than they should be. The recorder hums in the middle of the table, and my voice crawls into it like a patient animal seeking warmth. There are nights when the candles gutter and the recorder's metal goes cold, and you can feel your breath inventing the room for you, shaping the dark into stories that will be paid for later. Once, in a lull between questions, the archivist slid a file folder toward me, as if offering bread. The folder smelled like damp paper and a faint, cultivated grief. It contained photograph prints, brittle and salt-stained, of a man who was not me and a village I had never visited. The pictures were uneven, edges frayed like seashells. A child in one, a group of women mending nets in another, a facade of a building with paint peeled into confetti. I told them I had no memory of that place. The colonel nodded in the way people nod when they are counting and not listening to what is being spoken. He turned the photograph over, thumb running along its edge, and said nothing. The ledger knows how to receive silence and translate it to guilt. Silence has weight here. It compacts like clay, and then they shape it into confessions. There were nights when I woke thinking someone else was sleeping in my bed. Not a body, but a presence. A name that had been pressed into me like a stamp. I would find myself walking through the memory of another man's house with the wrong furniture and the right grief. These are the ghosts that practical files invite, not specters of flesh, but extradited identities, loaned for the convenience of a confession. They come with particularities: a smell of tobacco in the hallway, a child's scuffed shoe beneath a chair, the exact angle of light that cuts across a kitchen table, and if you repeat them enough they will sew themselves to your chest like badges. It is difficult to draw a line between what they demanded and what the mind supplies. Under pressure, memory is porous. The mind will take a misfiled name and make it yours if only to end the pressure. They used patience as a rasp. They used lights that blurred the border between day and memory. They sat me for hours on the iron chair and made me count the seconds in the dark until my thoughts were a bead of water sliding down a window, and the ledger could scoop them up. When you are kept to counting, your life becomes arithmetic: 3 beats of silence, 7 meaningless particulars, 1 confabulated alibi. The ledger feeds on pattern. Once, a man was wheeled out of the next room and left for a day in the corridor. He was hollowed. His confession was a list of betrayals so precise I could not tell whether it had been fabricated with cruelty or copied from a different ledger. He smelled faintly of disinfectant and boiled clothes, so someone had tried to scrub identity from him and had only thinned it. The archivist examined it with gauzy interest and then placed it in a stack labeled useful. There are categories in the vault that do not line up with truth: useful, disposable, permanent. Useful is the most dangerous. It means a life will be bent into a shape someone else needs. Disposable means it can be burned or misfiled without consequence. Permanent is an ironic title. Permanence here is only the will to forget. I do not know which category I was meant for. I only know the way the colonel smiled when he turned my name in his register: not cruelty exactly, but a satisfaction not unlike the one someone might feel while pruning a bonsai until it fits a theory. I discovered a trick: if you tell a story with enough texture, the ledger will accept the details and forget to ask for verification. It does not matter whether the details are true if they are vivid. The trick unsettled me because it meant the only defense I had left was the slow work of invention. I began to hide the truth inside other truths, a half-remembered street name, a childhood song hummed to myself under my breath, a scar that had nothing to do with what they wanted. Those things seemed real enough for the ledger to hold, and they bought me time. The scar under my left arm is true. I burned it on a stove when I was 7. I can tell them the story of the burn with exactitude, the pan, the smell of oil, the scream that brought my mother running. When memory feels contingent, such small truths become anchors. Sometimes the ledger contained confessions made by people who had never been interrogated in the present. Names that appeared then disappeared, as if the papers themselves were composing and decomposing a reality without human witnesses. The archivist had her pencil notes and her small ledger of anomalies. When she thought no one watched, she would fold a corner on a page and whisper a date. Those whispers were not audible to me, but I felt them like drafts against the knuckles of my hand. She treated the pages as if they might catch cold otherwise. The creased corners in her secret book seemed to be attempts to shelter certain facts from the draught of erasure. On the 3rd week, they began to present me with photographs that refused to be explained. Faces caught in the background, half obscured by a shadow, repeated across different files. I saw the same face pasted to different names and ages: a child in a protest, an older man in a factory, an unremarkable clerk in a line. All of them wore the same indifferent smile. The effect was like watching a single coin used to buy many things. The ledger wanted me to assign meaning. I started to suspect that the Vault's inventory included more than bodies and dates. It held replicas of being. A likeness, it seems, can be spent repeatedly if no one who knows the original is left to protest. The ledger economizes identity until there is nothing left but exchange value. There was one page in the archivist's secret ledger where she had penciled a string of numbers and then crossed them out. She kept that page folded against her chest when she walked. I watched her once, standing by the stairwell, fingers bent around the ledger as if holding a small bird. For a brief second her face loosened into grief, and I realized she was not there simply to catalogue. She was trying to keep some fragment of truth off the official list. That small act looked like rebellion next to the neat pins and stamps on her desk. Later she left a single folded sheet on my table, face down and annotated with a ticked note, the handwriting small and almost apologetic, unreliable. She had risked something small by marking me so. I held the slip like contraband. The colonel enjoys little displays. He takes satisfaction in ordering players into particular shapes and watching whether their stories fit the lines he has drawn. He wants tidy confessions. History for him is a ledger that must be obedient. He will sit long enough to watch a man become compliant and then stamp him with the appropriate label. He believes in the alchemy of paper. He believes a sentence written down changes the world. He thinks if a name is written into the right column, the world will line up and obey. He does not imagine that paper has its own desires. I learned the geometry of fear. It is not the pain alone. It is the predictability of how pain will be used, the way a person can be arranged so their memory collapses along chosen seams. The vault is not merely a room for extracting truth. It is a factory for producing usable history. After enough sessions, the names on my tongue began to taste like the names from other phylus, borrowed, smooth, memorized. I was both prisoner and curator of a narrative that pleased them. There is a peculiar dignity in the act of curatorship, arranging lies, so they have the gravity of artifacts, but it was a dignity I never asked for. One night, near the end of a long run of questions, I felt something slip in my chest like a key turning. It was not surrender so much as a recognition of the ledger's appetite. I watched myself offering an invented alibi and felt it stitch into the fabric of my life. The recorder captured it without morality. The metal cylinder at the table does not care if what it stores will make a man disappear later. It is an impartial bank machine for memory. It will keep the wrong name, the harmless detail, the one that will be used to justify a verdict I will never hear. I imagined my voice in that machine years from now, a fossilized thing turned over by distant hands with no idea of the palms that once made it. At times, the vault produced confessions that were too vivid to be honest. Men described atrocities in careful, exact terms that seemed rehearsed. The archivist would annotate these with a pencil, and then, when Lena thought no one looked, she'd rub the graphite as if erasing a bruise. It gave me a small, private hope that someone else saw what was happening and could not bear the accounting. Once she sat for a long time after an interrogation, fingers worrying at the margin where the confession had been entered. And I heard her whisper into her palm a name that had been taken from a man who could no longer say it aloud. Her whisper did not save him, but it was a testament that at least one person kept the sound of his name alive in private. There is a ritual to madness under surveillance. The mind begins to forestall the next question by providing an earlier answer. People will make confessions about crimes they must have committed in other lives because the room's architecture makes them believe they are protecting some other self. I guarded the smallest things. I kept a knotted scarf hidden in my collar, a tiny anchor on my chest of small fact. When the ledger wanted to ask about names, I could fold my truth around that scarf and say nothing more. That scarf smelled true. It had the faint perfume of the street vendor who sold it, a rivulet of oil and lemon, and that specificity made it stubbornly real. The colonel could not stamp a smell. In a way, I learned to become a ledger myself. I catalogued what they wanted and tried to refuse with specificity. I told them a memory of rain on a different street. I described the way a neighbor's dog would pace when thunder came. Small, truthful sensory details confused them, because they could not easily be allotted into clean categories. The archivist noticed those details. Her eyes would linger on the index card where I had tucked a marginal note, and for a minute she seemed younger and less certainly resigned. Sometimes she would even pencil a tiny star at the corner of my card, a private punctuation of approval, then quickly erase it as though ashamed of being moved. There is an image I return to with a compulsive clarity, a reflection in a puddle on the cellar floor showing a face that was not mine. The puddle lay like a black bowl beneath the stairwell, where the water collected to oil made a rainbow halo at its edge. I remember reaching down, wanting to touch the water and see it ripple away the borrowed features, but my hand met only cold stone and the alley glass of the puddle. The face moved differently there. It smiled with someone else's bruised patience. I tried to name the feeling. Grit was like being an actor in a photograph that had been taken without your consent. The reflected face had its own history, and therefore its own authority. To possess that image was to be complicit in someone else's erasure. At some point I realized that not every confessor in the ledger was a real person. There were entries that described lives, the Black Vault confessions that weren't tea. I have learned to count in the rhythm of interrogation. There is the intake air drawn through teeth, like the closing of a trap. The measured set of a recorder that will hold nothing, but sanctioned shape-pace the leaning in silence that asks for a name and will not accept anything softer than certainty. I record so that something of me remains unshaped by the ledger. This account is not for absolution. It is a stubborn remnant, a tiny scrap of unassimilated memory folded into the margin of their file. The Black Vault lives beneath everything, beneath the clatter of the city, beneath the bureaucratic offices, beneath even the polite voices of clerks who sign forms in the daytime. It is a room that keeps itself cold for reasons that are not entirely practical. The air tastes of metal and old paper. Stone walls sweat in the winter. A single bulb or a candle is chosen by mood and task. It throws oil, paint chiaroscuro across faces like a ritual that insists on exposing certain angles and hiding others. They prefer shadows that can hold a lie long enough for it to become necessary. Memory in the vault is not a continuous line. It is a set of panels, each one painted and varnished by the person who asked for it, the interrogator, the archivist, the state. When the state wants a truth, it builds it, like a cabinet, compartments labeled, hinges greased, locks measured to a click. They bring me to the table and ask me to fit into those compartments. The table is scarred wood, a recorder between my hands, a brass key on a chain near where Colonel Myrov sets his glove. Lena Orlova moves the documents like a woman who reads grief for a living. Her fingers are ink, stained and tremble when no one looks. I was given codename 47 before they ever seamed my name into a file. Codename is a convenience effort. It severs the last thread that ties a person to a past. They say it is cleaner. They reduce a life to numerals and then press until the numerals bleed something legible. My hands, once steady enough to carry a briefcase, learn to count the nails in the table one by one. My left wrist remembers the strap that dug into bone, a knot of improvised leather that left a constellation of scar tissue. Breath trimmers became punctuation. I learned the language of intake, hold, and forced release. The voice on the recorder is mine, but not mine. It is a voice permitted, rationed, and sometimes entirely manufactured by the sound of someone else's expectations. I do not recount every technique. The vault is a grammar of pain that sorts itself. Naming each instrument would be giving form to the apparatus, and they already have more forms than names. They work like gardeners who know a soil will yield a certain plant if tended with precise cruelty. Yet there are particularities to the methods that matter: the slow timing, the alternation of warmth and cold to confuse perception, the empty hours in which the body begins to substitute hypothesis for memory. Hunger teaches the mind to lie in the smallest ways. Exhaustion becomes permissive of invention. If the question is persistent enough, the answer becomes pliant. If the silence is a blade that cuts only in air, sooner or later you will say anything to stop bleeding from the inside. Confessions in the vault are not always confessions. They are often rehearsals of facts that will later be appended to other documents, woven into a wider net that looks less like truth and more like tapestry. Reporters would call it a framem, priests would call it a symptom, bureaucrats call it efficiency. The ledger that Lena keeps her tiny, furtive book records anomalies. She places a tab where a name was borrowed, where a photograph is inexplicably different from the face that accompanies it, where an admission is too tidy to be the result of human fallibility. She does not speak aloud. Her ledger is an act of quiet resistance, an indexing of error. She knows not all errors are mistakes. There were nights when the confessions spoke of things that had no origin. Men would speak of meetings that never took place, of names of collaborators who did not exist, of operations with geographical impossibilities. One man described a safe house at the edge of a fjord that was 300 miles from the nearest water. Another insisted on the existence of a woman who collected other people's hair in little ceramic jars. We catalogue these inventions with the same clinical breath we used to catalogue crimes. Colonel Myrov would smile in a way that looked like a calculation, and then dictate how a false confession could be repurposed as evidence, as leverage, as a vector for new arrests. History, he seemed to think, is to be sewn together from whatever cloth one has. He never spoke to me in a human voice. His language was the precise cadence of a clock, an economy of small kindnesses and surgical silences. Many of the confessions I contain in my memory feel like pages removed from other books, borrowed lines, misremembered phrases, echoes of something read recently. Under fatigue, the mind will fit a borrowed face to a memory because it cannot, in a collapsing moment, hold a face that has never been given one. The vault cultivates that collapse. They are not merely searching for admissions of guilt, they are cultivating entire genealogies of suspicion. They plant names, watch for roots, and when roots appear they dig them into the file as if the file were bedrock. There was one confession that changed the texture of the room. It was not mine. It arrived in a recording that had been left running in an empty cell, a tape found by the archivist while she catalogued a mislabeled box. The voice on that tape spoke calmly, as if reading a prepared statement. It named people I knew and places that had never existed in my life. It confessed to acts that, if true, would have reshaped months of our small existence into something monstrous. The tape ended with a laugh that had been stripped of joy. The archivist brought the tape into the lighted room with a pair of spectacles and a hand that shook. Colonel Marov listened to it twice and then had Lena file it as evidence. I watched him hold the recorder like a scalpel and felt my ribs tighten as if anticipating an incision. The tape was entered into the ledger and became, by proxy, part of the truth. There are shadows that betray themselves. In the reflection of a puddle on the concrete floor a face appears that does not belong to the person crouched by the wall. Small anomalies accumulate. A photograph pinned to a wall shows a man slightly younger than the one in its frame. Marginalia in a file references a date that never existed. The key on Marov's chain opens a drawer in a room where nothing is kept. Lena notices these and moves them like a woman sweeping crumbs beneath the tablecloth of history. She keeps a narrow, secret ledger of errors. I watched once as she folded a single transcript and put it inside her cardigan. She closed her hand over it like someone closing a wound. Sometimes they want me to say names that do not belong to anyone I have met. When sleep was thin and the strap left a heat bruise on my ankle, I would conjure a person to satisfy the question, a neighbor with no face, a friend with borrowed gestures. The interrogator will then nest that invented person inside the record and produce proof, a photograph, a letter, a witness coerced into corroboration. It works because human memory belongs as much to suggestion as to experience. They compress implication into acceptance. There is a small key, brass and dull, that Marov keeps on his chain. He turns it in his fingers the way someone fondles a rosary. It is a trivial object, but it had power in the vault because it suggested permission. He never explained its purpose, but once held it to the light in the thin way a scientist studies a specimen. Many nights I imagined that the key unlocked something metaphysical, an archive of all pressured admissions. Once I tried to steal it in the small hours when fatigue clumsily became courage. My hand found the chain under a thin flicker of candlelight, but Marov's glove folded onto the table with the sound a glove makes when it is put on like armor. He smiled with his mouth and left his eyes sterile. The recording machine is patient. It does not judge. It stores in the same plastic coil both confession and invention. I learned slowly to tell it every fragment I could name. There is the night I dreamed the walls had teeth, and they bit names out of my tongue. There is the time I described a funeral I never attended. There are lists of names that taste like cardboard. I offered them up because sometimes offering made the pain smaller. In return, the state accepted my inventory and pressed it into service. Once an evening's ramble was entered into a dossier and used to justify a first arrest. A laugh that had no body became a lead in a crackdown. The ledger thrives on that willingness, on the human habit of filling silence with something. Not all confessions led to immediate harm. Some were catalogued in the dim middle drawers oddities that later fed a curious bureaucracy of rumor. Others were used as bargaining chips, minor currencies exchanged for remission or for the promise of fewer hours under the light. The Black Vault is a market where names are currency. The exchange rate is pain calibrated in hours and degrees. Those who had access to the ledger learned to trade in ambiguity. They understood the sly economy of imprecision. Say less, and the state will fill in the rest. Lena kept a small ledger of anomalies, and I read it once, under the pretense of borrowing a shirt. Her handwriting was neat and ruled. She had catalogued dates that could not exist, people who walked through the lists of names as ghosts do in old stories. She had drawn a map in the margins, a line that connected a row of file numbers to a puddle in the far corridor that always smelled of iron. I could not tell whether she hoped to save anyone or only to remember that something had gone wrong. Perhaps both. She kept a faded ribbon in her pocket that smelled faintly of chamomile. On the last page she had written, in a script that trembled, one single question mark. There are secondary confessions, those uttered by instruments, reports generated by third parties, addenda affixed by clerks. They are tidy, bureaucratic, and worse for their politeness. They claim that the person in question was an instigator, a courier, a conspirator. Once such a claim is admitted into the ledger, it acquires a kind of retroactive reality. Photographs are retouched, dates are shifted, neighbors are suddenly available and willing to testify to behaviors they had not previously noted. The vault's true horror is not always the tools and straps it is the mechanism that allows a whisper to become a document and a document to become a decree. I do not know how many of the confessions were true in the sense one reserves for a court. It is possible some were. It is also certain that many were not. It is possible that some of the names are merely placeholders for something the state feared enough to invent. The worst, perhaps, is the way in which the vault teaches you to doubt the fidelity of your own memory. You begin to inhabit a margin where you are both subject and author. You remember, you embellish, you produce. One day a woman was brought in who insisted she had been a midwife in a village that did not exist on any map in our records. Her hands trembled like someone who still feels the shape of a baby's skull. They kept her for 3 nights, and then released her to the street. She walked away much thinner than when she had arrived, and yet when the archives were adjusted, the state now possessed a midwife's ledger with deliveries recorded. The ledger said she had been present. She had not. I write this because the ledger of history is built the same way. Books and records accept offerings. They do not always ask healthy questions about origin. They prefer narrative. They will absorb whatever voice is loudest and then call it truth. The Black Vault taught me to be suspicious of the elegant line. If the account is too neat, then someone shaped it to neatness in the vault often indicates workmanship of a malign sort. The state is an artisan of tidy stories. They cut out the ragged edges and glue the seams until the fabric looks smooth. There are nights when I imagine the ledger itself might come alive, when the paper raises its head and coughs out the names it has eaten. I imagine Colonel Murrov waking in the small hours and finding 100 pages of his own handwriting accusing him. Those are small fantasies, soothing. In daylight, he remains composed and exact. He will count under his breath and hand me another sheet. Lena will fold it into her cardigan. The brass key will sit patient as a tooth on his chain. What I have recorded in this account is not the whole truth. No vault permits that. It is, rather, the anatomy of a system that made confessions into building material. It catalogues the ways in which memory can be mined and how the results can be planted like seeds in a field. Sometimes a seed sprouts into a guilty party. Sometimes it grows into a salacious rumor that sustains the machinery of fear. Sometimes it dies in the soil and no one notices. But the ledger learns to speak in such a way that even the dead can be read as conspirators. If you read this and think of villains in capes or dramatic betrayals, you have not spent their hours with their lights set low and their silencers poised. Cruelty is often patient and domestic. It knows the names of hours and how to apply a silence in stages. It prefers to be tidy. It will ask you, politely, to give it the shape it desires, and then, when you have complied, it will lock the door and add your answer to a list. Sometimes in the small hours I fold my hands and wonder whether the ledger will wind down and release its hold. I wonder whether the archivist's ledger will be enough to break the pattern. I imagine the brass key rusting. I picture the files unstitched, and their pages scattered like leaves on the cold pavement. I do not know whether such visions are useful. They are, at best, a way to stay awake long enough to remember the name can be a burden and that truth is a thing heavy enough to be used as a weapon. There is one final thing to note: the people who come into the vault leave more than bodies. They leave echoes. The confessions they gave, or were made to give, reverberate beyond the room, through districts and ministries, into the small kitchens where mothers whisper, and into the offices where file clerks stamp with machine-like hands. A single false admission can tilt a family, redirect a career, erase a neighbor. The ledger's reach is long because documents travel on mustard-colored paper, and because bureaucrats prefer to believe a neatly written line. When I file this record, I do not expect it to overturn the ledger. I do it to keep a small thing alive, the notion that memory can be tender and messy, and that not everything pressed into the mouth of a recorder should be trusted. I leave a mark in the margin. Perhaps someone will find it. Perhaps no one will. I do not ask for absolution, only acknowledgement. The Black Vault trained me to speak when required and to measure when not. In those small private reckonings I will continue to keep count not of names the state needs, but of the moments when memory resisted being taken. They are small resistances, mere splinters in the wood. They will not rebuild a house, but they are proof that something in us refuses to be catalogued without protest. The Black Vault, the ledger that answers nothing. I write this record with fingers that remember the weight of iron and the shape of a question that will not be allowed to rest. The room beneath the archives keeps time differently. It counts in wet footsteps, in the slow drip from a fissure in stone, in the way a page turns when a hand trembles. My name was never meant to live on lips. I was a number, a code name, a thin line in a ledger that claimed to know who I was. What follows is not an apology, nor a confession in the comfortable sense of contrition. It is an inventory of what remained when the interrogator took everything he could find useful and left the rest to rot in the dark margins. It began with the ledger. Lina kept ledgers like a person keeps a heart, close, careful, and full of stains. She moved through the stacks with the habit of someone who had outlived surprise, the slow, patient gait of someone who had learned how to let evidence accrete, rather than insist on immediate truth. The ledger that mattered was not the official book with neat entries and rubber stamps. It was a small brown notebook she folded into the back of a drawer and slid a faded ribbon over like a thumb closing a wound. Its cover was rubbed thin in one corner where a thumb had worried it, perhaps during a long train ride or a sleepless night. Pages inside were crowded with names that had been borrowed from other pages, with cross-references and marginalia written in a whisper, thin hand. Shortened notes that looked like prayers or warnings. The ledger did not declare guilt. It declared usefulness, and usefulness, as the apparatus saw it, was the only moral category that mattered. The KGB makes mercy into arithmetic. You are valuable or you are not. You are useful or you are nothing. Usefulness could be manufactured. A grain of truth surrounded by a lattice of lies will glint like a mote in floodlight. Colonel Myrov taught me this lesson before I learned to count the bands of a rosary with my eyes closed to keep from seeing what his hands did with them. He treated memory as a malleable thing, as raw material to be reshaped. He would place a false photograph on the table, whisper a date into a pause like an incision, and watch as a man's recollection, already hungry from long nights, ate that offering and forgot the difference. The technique was never sudden, it was arithmetic of attrition. Small, plausible adjustments were piled upon one another until the original outline of a life could no longer be seen. I have tried to remember how the first false thing took root. Memory is not one thing, for it is a house of rooms, some on fire and some underwater. Under the low bulb, with the recorder on the table like a small, persistent animal. The techniques were clinical and ritual at once, the slow tilting of a truth into a lie by omission, the selective replaying of a frightened man's life until the life was reduced to a map that fit the interrogator's needs. They were experts in rhythm, the rhythm of a question repeated until the asker's voice became the metronome for the responses they wanted. At times the methods were far more literal. The body is a ledger, and they knew how to make it sign away what it did not understand. They treated pain like ink and sleep deprivation like a sharp pen. If you could not keep your eyes focused, you could not be trusted to maintain the integrity of remembered time. There were nights when I watched other men confess to murders they could not have committed, to betrayals that had fingerprints impossible to place. The room held their confessions like a netter the truth slid through, and the net caught the shapes the state required. Some confessions smelled of desperation and alcohol and were easily snatched clean from the throat. Others were born of sustained pressure of a face pressed to cold stone until the world made only a single sound. Of sleep stolen so completely the mind began to produce hallucinations that resembled facts. I remember one man who admitted with a kind of wary relish that chilled me to meetings held under Leyland pines with men who bore names that never existed. He described them in the unsteady past tense, as if the act of confessing made them more solid. The officers recorded him in neat script and later dropped a photograph of a tree-lined street into his file. The photograph had nothing to do with what he had said, but in the ledger the photograph and his words tied together like two stitches that would hold the fabric of accusation in place. I kept a small scrap of paper folded in the sole of my shoe when I could. It was not a map to an escape. It was not a code. It was a single line of detail. I would not let them take the color of my sister's handkerchief, the place where an old man had taught me to whistle, the exact way the light caught the ridge of my father's eyebrow at tea time. These fragments became acts of defiance because the system wanted me to become nothing but a proof in its files. The ledger swallowed details and regurgitated confessions. The ledger pleased them. A ledger that answered nothing was worse than no ledger at all. Unanswered records invited rumor, which the apparatus would then harvest into a new file. For a while I thought the scrap in my shoe was sentimental folly, a talisman of sorts, until I saw how even the smallest preserved detail could disrupt a line of questioning. How a memory of the wrong color or a recalled taste could make a recorder hesitate long enough for someone else's conscience to become noisy. Colonel Myrov was the kind of man who smiled like a hinge, apparently harmless until you leant your weight against him and found yourself trapped to the wall. He never raised his voice at his cruelty was volumeless, delivered in surgical intervals. He kept a slim recorder that he handled as if making a sacrament. He asked questions that were not questions but permission for him to rewrite your past into the present. He loved keys. He carried one on a chain, a small brass thing with a crescent notch, and he tapped it against the table when someone hesitated. The sound meant that a door could open or close upon you depending on how he chose to read you. Sometimes he would take a pen and write a name in front of you, forcing your mouth to practice pronouncing it, as if the cadence of your speech could make the person real. The key tinked, the pen ticked, the recorder hummed. The ritual was elegant in its cruelty. The archivist, Lena, was both a complicity and a remnant. She moved at the edge of cruelty without committing to it. She maintained the system because she perhaps believed files were safer than lives, or because she believed in the sanctity of records even when the records were rotten. She kept a ledger of anomalies. It was her rebellion, thin as a cut. Where others trusted the ledger to baptize the truth, she used a margin to mark where the baptisms were false. She would bring a page from that hidden notebook to the table, a marginal note, a date that did not belong, a name that had been excised from official print, and slide it toward me with eyes that did not fully meet mine. We learned a language of small movements. She would fold a sheet, press it to the corner of my palm, and then, as if it were a dangerous confession, blink as if to deny the token's existence. Once, when power went out for a long hour and the men in uniform cursed and lit matches, Lena placed 3 index cards under my hand and only then smiled. The brief expression of someone who had traded a heavy secret for a lighter burden. There is a kind of torture that leaves no bruise to photograph. It sets up an apparatus and then begins the lights that never quite go out, the recorded footsteps that might be someone else, the slow drip that is measured with the same patience the interrogator applies to you. They taught me to catalog time in the rhythm of a drip. The mind will attempt to narrate itself in such conditions to preserve sanity. The interrogators then listened to that narration and reprinted it in a tidy font of culpability. You tell a story to survive a night. They make that story the evidence of your guilt. You say someone's name aloud to cling to the sound of meaning, and the ledger receives that name like a donation that can be cashed. Once, they presented me with a photograph that showed a man at a window. The face was blurred at the edges, as if eaten by smoke. I was told he had met agents under a slated sky. I had to decide whether to deny everything or to begin building a memory that would align with what they already had. Denial brings a different kind of pressure, a prolonged campaign of minimization until you begin to mistake silence for complicity. Eventually, even silence can be folded into a confession. They would mark the margins with what they claimed to be your hesitations. Any pause you took would be reinterpreted. If you frowned, it was proof of recognition. If you lowered your eyes, it was proof of shame. They made an index out of your natural human gestures. Sometimes the ledger included people who did not exist. A name would return in a dozen files with different dates, different crimes, different testimonies, and each ledger entry would cross-reference another that led nowhere, a cleanly excised name, an office that had no address. I once spent an afternoon following one of those trajectories, tracing a name that seemed to be a pin stuck into everyone's map. It had no birth record, no last known address. It was like following a rabbit hole that kept opening into blank cupboards. Some ghosts were inventions meant to be used as booby traps, accused of meetings with dead men, implicated in plots with other nothings. The state is surprisingly good at inventing the right kind of absence. You confess to a meeting, and the photograph appears retroactively. You confess to a plan, and witnesses are produced who swear they were present but have no faces you can place. Sometimes the witnesses had been coerced into believing the thing themselves. Sometimes they had been instructed to forget who they were until their own files would bind them to a story. I learned to stage a mind in counterpoint to their interventions. There were rooms where I would trace a set of memories like Braille, the kitchen where my mother burned jam, the smell of river reed in summer, the particular way my sister laced her boots to pull against the cold. I would become very precise about useless things, the notch on a spoon, the way snow collects in a shoe, the tiny chip on a teacup. These were not heroic recollections. They were ballast. When pressed, a mind anchored in minutiae can sometimes withstand the insistence of a false narrative long enough for someone else to notice the inconsistency. But such anchors are fragile. The interrogator will pick at them like a child at a scab, waiting for the moment when the anchor loosens and floats away. There were days I practiced these small facts until their retelling became an incantation, a list of banalities, said to stave off the appetite of the ledger. Not all confessions were fabricated. There were true things in the vault, true cruelties, true betrayals committed because the system forced hands. The ledger stuck these truths beside lies like bones in a single jar. It made them indistinguishable at the edge and therefore usable. When the state constructs a file, it is less interested in justice than in the utility of truth. A true fact is valuable if it can be rearranged to support the file's thesis. Even a real crime becomes more valuable when it can be braided with false testimony, when victims are asked to sign the wrong names in exchange for sleep. I saw a woman weep over a list of grievances and then, in the same breath, be asked to place a name next to one of the crimes. She did not recognize the man she named. She named because naming was currency. Lena would sometimes fold open the ledger where anomalies lived and tap a date as if trying to start a clock that would not take. She confided without speaking, She kept a running list of files where signatures did not match witnesses, where the same photograph had been used twice under different captions, where a child's name had been erased and replaced by a code name. I would trace those annotations with a finger and feel like an archaeologist learning to read a language that had been changed mid-sentence to hide a crime. She showed me one page where 3 separate affidavits all shared the same clumsy flourish at the end of a signature, a flourish that only a single hand had made. The flourish could have been coincidence. Lena tapped the page and slid it toward me, as if it were a coin that could buy evasions. Sometimes she would bring a pencil and draw a small dot beside an entry, and then look up as if to say, without saying, "Do you see?" I did, and the seeing was a kind of danger. It is a difficult thing to retain a sense of yourself when everything you know is targetable. The body becomes a terrain to be occupied. They pressed me into forms that fit their preconceptions. They asked me to become more gullible, more guilty, or sometimes less so. They calibrated the story with the cold precision of a mechanic tuning a machine. There were nights when I was made to play at being a spy merely to test a hypothesis. If a man believes he is a spy long enough, he will begin to fabricate the minutes, the meetings, the clandestine marks he says he remembers. The apparatus was not merely institutional, it was theological in its certainty that the truth can be ordained. Their catechism taught that if you repeated a lie and the ledger accepted it, the lie had become a fact of administration. Once, there was a moment that almost broke the choreography. Lena slid a page across the table with a marginal annotation, a different handwriting, a number that connected 3 otherwise unrelated files. For a while no one noticed the thread. It was easy to miss a slip of paper tucked in a pocket, an index card out of place. But a ledger that answers nothing begins to make noise when the gaps are sketched together. When the ledger was opened wider, it revealed an archival architecture of deliberate misattribution. The revelations did not absolve anyone. They merely reallocated blame in ways that felt more strategic than punitive. In the stacks, I saw how entire columns of dates had been shifted as if someone had erased a line and then traced over it with a different pen. It was bureaucratic vandalism, the deliberate falsification of chronology to create an alibi for the system itself. In the end, there was a choice made for me and one I made for myself. The state will always offer a man the appearance of control as a torment. Confess this, and your mother will be unhurt for a week. Confess that, and the ledger will add a supporting datum that makes your months less violent. The choices were violent for being between survival and integrity. I learned to answer in the terms of a ledger. Where a name would be useful, they would be given one. Where a name would make no sense, they would invent it. I discovered that the most dangerous thing to the state was not the truth, but inconsistency. A truth that contradicted their story was a leak required sealing. Once you sealed a leak with a false name, the file would accept the repair, and you were then compelled to live within the mend. After the fact, when the soft light of a candle was all I had, and the ledger lay closed and heavy as a heart, I realized the deeper cruelty. The apparatus did not merely take events from me. It took the very possibility of a stable past. To be endlessly rewritable is to be perpetually vulnerable. The ledger that answered nothing gave them a perfect instrument. It could transform silence into confession, and confession back into silence whenever necessary. There is a kind of violence in erasure that outlives the moment of erasure. The place that once housed a name becomes an absent space that calls itself into existence with the thin authority of a bureaucrat's stamp. This record is not a reclamation of every memory. Some rooms in me have already been redecorated by those who had the power to do so. What I can offer is an inventory of techniques they used, of little resistances that lasted, of the thin acts where Lena pretended to be clerical and gave me a piece of paper folded like a promise. I offer this ledger of recollection as a counter-archive. where their files tried to produce a single useful version of me. I preserved the mess of living, the